Dum 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 dum. There's a stain on my garment, dear Aisha, dear Aisha. There's a stain on my garment, dear Aisha, a stain. Tell me how did it get there, Muhammad, Muhammad? Tell me how did it get there, Muhammad? Tell me. Sexy slave girls, dear Aisha, dear Aisha, dear Aisha. Sexy slave girls, dear Aisha. I just lost control. There's Maria Al-Qubtiya, Rayana bin Sayed, Ayman, and others. You know I can't wait. But Bilal's calling Adhan, Muhammad, Muhammad. Now it's time for the salat, Muhammad, it's time. Then scrape it, dear Aisha, dear Aisha, dear Aisha. Then scrape it, dear Aisha, dear Aisha, scrape it. Sahih Muslim 572-3377, Surah 66, Al-Bukhari 232, Surah 424.
Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. And Muhammad is not a prophet. Muhammad is not a prophet. If you want grace and mercy and love, Islam is not for you. But Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the King of Kings who died to save us all. If you just repent and believe He took your sins on the cross, then mercy and grace, forgiveness and love, eternity can be yours. But Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god.
Hallelujah. Let Lord Jesus Christ shine forth. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us. Welcome to another live stream with DCCI Ministries to talk about reliability of the Islamic tradition with Jay Smith. Peace of Christ with you, Jay.
Good to be with you, Hatun. Thank you.
Why were you late, Jay?
I'm not late. I'm right on time. Look at your watch. I'm sorry, but this is time. We said 7:30. It's now 7:34 because of those crazy songs you put before us.
It wasn't crazy songs, I think, first of all. Secondly, I asked you to be there 15 minutes early for sound check. So now we've got to do sound check.
There was an accident on the road, which I'd had nothing to be a part of. So I had to go and do a detour. But I got here on time, 7:31.
So that means you are 1 minute late. That's okay. Thanks for confirming that. Can you confirm, those of you who are listening, if the sound from Jay's side is okay? That will be very, very helpful. How have you been, Jay?
Good. We've been up to see our grandson, our brand little new grandson, 3 months old.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. My second grandchild.
Is that means you are getting older and older?
Oh, look at me. I've already been older and older. It's about time I had some grandchildren, don't you think? Why do I have to wait till I'm gray-haired to get a grandchild? Some people get it when they're in their 30s. No, wait a minute, 40s.
I don't think they like that, though.
Well, they do. I wish I did. I'm in my 70s. Finally. My kids have been waiting a long time, and I've been waiting a long time to get them to have children. So now they're starting to come in, and my wife and I, we're enjoying it to the hilt.
Good. You are doing babysitting and looking after them?
My wife does the babysitting. I sit there and I burp him when he needs to be after he's been fed. I'm not much of a father. I was not much of a grandfather as well. I wait till the child can speak and get into conversation and have a discussion and a debate. Then they are, as far as I'm concerned, until then, they're just babies. Now, once they can speak and have a discussion, that takes about 2 years. Then they really become people that I really enjoy. Meantime, before that, my wife does all the cuddling and as good grandmothers are supposed to do, and the spoiling.
Well, in that case, so while your wife is doing all the job and it looks like you are just digging into Muhammad and trying to figure out what Islamic tradition shows us regarding his life. Is that right assumption?
Yeah, I mean, this is the $1 million question. You had all those pictures of Muhammad. You assumed that he lived. We've always assumed that he lived. We always assumed that he had a rich life for about 50 to 60 years. We assumed that he was born in a place called Mecca, that he lived there until 622 when he moved into a place called Medina, had been called Yathrib to that time. So all of this, I've always assumed there's been no reason to question it. There's no reason for us to even have a show on it, because that's the narrative we've always been taught. That's the narrative you've been taught. That's the narrative everybody that's listening has been taught. Why would we question it?
We question it because when we look at the Bible, we get to see how history and biblical account confirms one another. When one of them is silent, history steps in and then fills that gap. When history is silent, Bible steps in and then fills that gap. And it came to our attention that's not the case in Islam. So when history is silent, Islam has no contribution to it.
Or put it the other way,
contradicts it.
Those who follow Islam have never really thought of the historical question. It's not been on their radar. To be fair, in the 1800s, it wasn't on the Christian church's radar. We never asked questions of whether or not Jesus existed, or whether or not there was a New Testament, Old Testament, whether or not they were authoritative. This really was introduced in Germany. It was in Germany in the 1800s where this started.
I'm not sure if I could agree with that, because when we read the church tradition, we get to see the discussions and debates on what is authorized or what is seen as the scripture. What are the criteria for the scripture? Yes, people who do not share Christian faith, or people who had curious minds, start asking these historical questions on the reliability of the scripture, whether it existed or not. But regarding like from very early stage of Christian faith, it's always been on the kind of on the stack to be questioned. Because remember, we talked about in the past how it was serious for someone to confess Christ, because they would be given to the lions as dinner. So you don't want to put your faith on something which has been taught to you as lie. When it comes to Islam, main questions on history has not been asked. I think one of the main reasons for that is because people didn't have the Arabic translation, so that end up in our hands pretty late. And once people had the translations of Bukhari or Sīrah, they start thinking about, oh, let's check this out. So like people start looking at the history much later than what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, now, to be fair, what you brought up, it is true. In the early church, there was a question as to which are the authoritative scriptures, which are the ones that really do talk about the life of Jesus, and also should we be trusting the Gnostic writings, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the second Epistle of Peter. These are the questions that were in the early church, and those were legitimate questions. But that all had to do with which books, which writings were to be trustworthy, and which were the ones that the church gave authority to. No one in the early church questioned whether or not Jesus existed. That never really came up. That was always assumed that he existed. It was only in the 1800s the Germans started questioning that. In Tübingen, Wellhausen, saying, hold on a minute, do we even know whether or not there was a Jesus? How can we know, since we don't have any eyewitness account, we don't even have any witness account for the person of Jesus? And that's really where it started in Germany. And so we have had to answer that question for the last 200 years. No one has dared to ask that question of Islam until Robert Spencer wrote a book on it in 2012. That was explosive, and he was laughed out of court. Everybody thought this guy was a fool. He was an idiot. You don't ask whether or not Muhammad exists. You don't ask that question. Well, for a number of reasons. It's not very healthy to ask that question. So when he did this in 2012, he certainly picked up my radar, and suddenly my antenna went up, and I said, wow, this is fascinating, because he's asking the right question. We should always ask that question of any historical figure. How do we know if someone makes a historical claim about a person who lived at a certain place at a certain time and said certain things and did certain things, how do we know that that is true? That's a perfectly legitimate question to ask. It was asked of Jesus. We answered that question. And that's why in the last 100 years, since 1905, up until where we are today in 2024, pretty much all those questions on the historicity of Jesus, what he said, what he did, where he went, and all the rest can have been answered. But that has not been asked of Islam, not of Muhammad. And that's why Robert and I, and you're a good friend with Robert Spencer. You've brought him on board. You've gone through his book together, or you've just now, I think you've just done on his the critical edition of his biography. We're going to be doing it next week, I understand. And I just ordered it so I can read it before next week. These are the questions that now need to be asked of Islam. We've had that test. We've gone through this. Islam has yet to do that.
So it would be very silly if I was one of the apostles of Lord Jesus Christ, and then someone is asking me, well, do you know if Jesus was exist? I'm just like, yeah, I was his apostle. We shared life together. We did ministry together. And then I put the writings down, and then informations within these writings are pretty much reliable. Locations, people, cities which has been mentioned historically has been proven. So there was no need for someone within a couple of 100 years. Or within even like much longer than that to say like, okay, this guy called Jesus was ever existed. As the time went on, of course, things changed because people knew accepting Jesus to be accepting Jesus to be the one who he claimed to be has the consequences. So you get on your knees and then you have to accept him as your Lord and your Savior, and that is difficult things for people to do it. Therefore, you need to dig into it and then find the ways to reject him. When it comes to Islam, when
Stop
we look
there. Don't completely Islam yet. Back up. Hold on. What you're saying is so important. I want to really underline what you're saying. People who were living at the time of Jesus, of course, never asked whether he lived or not. It's those who come after Jesus that ask the question. Why? Because those who were living at the time of Jesus in the first century, they didn't have cameras, they didn't have television, they didn't have newspapers. They had no record to show who he was except that what they wrote down. But what they wrote down was on papyrus. Papyrus are these interlocking leaves that after about 100 years, they just crinkle and disintegrate. They just dry up. So there was nothing that has been retained from the first century, from the eyewitnesses or the other witnesses that support that Jesus actually did exist. And that's why it's important that today in the 21st century or in the 19th century, when this came up, when people were saying, hold on a minute, did Jesus exist? Since we don't have any eyewitness account of any photographs or any type of implementation, we can go back to the first century. What do we have to support the historicity of Jesus? And that's why the whole manuscript evidence came up. That's why we got into manuscript, the whole thing to do with textual criticism, the whole to do with forensic evidence, codicology, and paleography became so important to be able to date and to be able to know how languages changes, how writing styles changes, how we can date manuscripts to support the historicity of Jesus. That's why it was important that we found hostile evidence, hostile witnesses, like people like Romans and Greeks and Jews who were also writing about this person named Jesus, not just ones from within the camp, but those from outside the camp. And that's why all of this apparatus that we now look at called historical criticism concerning the person of Jesus Christ that has been used to really confront his historicity. It is this apparatus that we didn't invent as Christians. Listen, we didn't invent anything. All we did was take what had already been given us, took things like redacted criticism or source criticism or in textual criticism, what we know as higher and lower criticism. We took these criticisms, we applied them to the person of Jesus Christ, we applied them to the gospel accounts, we applied them to those records of his life and what he did and what he said, and we matured them. We didn't invent them, we matured them, so much so that now 100 years later, we're now in the 21st century, we can take those same criticisms, that same apparatus of historical critical analysis and apply them now to Muhammad and apply them now to this man who is much more recent. Now we're talking about 700 years, 600 years more recent, but more than that, we're not talking about papyrus anymore, because the people that wrote about Muhammad were from the caliphal courts. They were people who were wealthy. They were living in Baghdad, and primarily in Baghdad. So they had all the finances to no longer to be dependent on papyrus. They could write on the animal skins. That's what we know as parchment, or that's what we know as vellum. And that's why all these documents that are now coming from the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th century, there should be an enormous amount of documents to support the historicity of this man Muhammad, because they didn't have papyrus disintegrates. Parchment does not disintegrate that quickly. In fact, we have got the best parchments, the best manuscripts we have for the Bible, the Sinaiticus, the Alexandrinus, the Vaticanus, the 3 Metropolitan manuscripts. Those are all written on parchment and on vellum. They're written on animal skin. Look at the Sinaiticus right here in London. It took about 50 to 60 deer skins just to write that one codex. But that codex, you can see it in the Red Black Gallery here in London. You've been there. I've been there. I've taken many people to see it. It is as durable today as the day it was written, almost. And that's why from the 4th century on in Christianity, parchment took over, and once that happened, there was no need to go to papyrus. By the 7th century, with Islam, with the caliphal courts, there was no need to write on papyrus. Everything would have been written on parchment and vellum. And so the question we're asking is, be careful. Don't assume because we don't have the originals that you don't need to have the originals. You absolutely do. Muslims have to have the originals because of the type of material they were written on. There's no excuse not to have any vellum or parchment reference or codes or reference of this man named Muhammad. That's what we're demanding, and that's what we're looking for, and that's why we're having discussion tonight.
Yeah, so it's not only they have, like, also think about it. Christianity has been under the persecution. So it wasn't like, oh, we had the materials and we were rich and we were able to afford and then write on the animal skin.
Absolutely. There it is.
Persecution and financial reasons were very high for Christian side. For Islam,
okay, stop right there. Don't go to Islam yet. When did the parchments and when did the vellum start to appear? In the 4th century. Why did they appear in the 4th century, not earlier? Do you know the answer?
Okay,
it's one person. His name is Constantine. It's because of Constantine, the emperor of the empire at that time. He was converted to Christianity. He was the one that commissioned. He had the means to. He is like the caliph of Islam. There's the equivalent. He had the means, he had the money, he had the finance, and he was the one that commissioned 50 codices to be created, to be written for the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. That's why, that time on, we have all kinds of manuscripts that support the New Testament.
There's a discussion regarding his conversion stuff, but he made Christianity legal, so it was okay to be Christian. And then he also like that kind of helped us to.
Hatun, he paid for those codices. He paid for those parchments.
Yeah, so
you need to have someone with wealth. You need to have someone with power to do this.
Before that, he made it legal for people to be Christian. So that's like much more important.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the codices, the manuscripts. Why do they appear suddenly in the 4th century and not before?
Once the persecution is being kind of reduced, and then there was financial support, then things are changed for Christian side.
Absolutely. And there is no persecution in Islam before that. Islam has always been in power from the very beginning.
Islam has been the one who persecutes. They had the financial means, as well as they were controlling what could go out. So
Hatun, you love to really dig it into the Muslims. I understand that, but let's keep to manuscript evidence. That's what I want to talk about tonight.
Yeah, I'm just trying to put them in a context. So the reason how Christian side is different than Islamic side.
Yeah.
So, as you expressed,
and that's why when Muslims come back and they say, but you don't have your originals, why you're asking us to have our originals, I'll come back and say, because there's no excuse for you not to have the originals. You had Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. You had them from that time, Muawiyah. Then after that, you had Malik. Then for that, you had the whole Umayyad Caliphate. From that, after that, you had the Abbasid Caliphate. These were all caliphs that commissioned all of these books and these manuscripts. These were not poor people. These were not people that they had no means. They had all the means at their disposal. Why in the world did they not write anything down?
Good
Bingo.
question.
As simple as that.
Good question. Why you, Jay, and Hatun hate Muslims? I don't hate
We
Muslims.
said it's hateful tonight.
I don't hate Muslims.
Why would we spend our lives working with Muslims if we hated them? We love them. They're the best people to work with. I don't know where Lars is coming from. Lars, be careful. Just because we're disputing about manuscripts, does that mean we hate somebody? Just because we're asking questions that have been asked of us? Were people hating us when they were asking these questions? Was Wellhausen hating Christians when he asked a perfectly legitimate historical question? Why does suddenly you hate somebody if you ask a question about their authority? To me, this idea of hate coming into the picture is absolutely ludicrous. But go ahead, Lars, keep that narrative if you want to. Be careful. We would not, Hatun and I would not be spending our lives. I've spent 40 years loving Muslims into the kingdom. If there is hate there, I would give it up long beforehand. My wife would have asked me to give it up. I've been old and wrinkled if I hated people. I cannot hate Muslims because I find them to be the most engaging people in the world. What I don't like, what I don't want, is when they start saying things about my book or my Lord Jesus Christ, and then they can't say the same thing about their book or their Muhammad. That's all we're talking about today. Take this hate off the page. There's no reason to bring that into here. You're just trying to get us angry. We're not going to get angry. We just love the fact that we can have the freedom to ask these kinds of questions. But let's get back to the subject again.
Okay, so I think this is also one of the cards they played for decades or centuries, if not. Every time when Islam is being questioned, they play the victim card of, oh, poor Muslims, you are not loving Muslims, you are not loving Muslims, and they shut down all the debates. But
Yeah.
if you cannot have an ideology which cannot even ask the questions or have an answer to the questions, I think you've got to think very serious about that ideology. At the end, it affects your eternity. So when we talked last, that was...
If Lars is going to say we're hating Muslims because we're asking questions about their manuscript, does he hate Christians for asking the same questions about our manuscript? Does that just be consistent at least? So therefore, should we shut down any inquiry of Christianity? Should we do that? Because if to inquire of Christians what is demanded of us, any historical criticism, that would assume that you hate us. No, you don't hate us. You want us to make sure that what we say we can support. That's all we're asking. Do support what you claim.
So a couple of weeks ago when we had live stream, I received a couple of emails where people wanted us to go through the manuscripts a little bit more detail because they said, Jay speaks too fast. I watched the video twice. I'm still not following.
All right.
So therefore, I got in touch with you and then I asked, okay, can we break it down more regarding what do we have about biography of Muhammad for manuscripts? What do we have for the manuscripts of the Hadith? And then break it down and then ask our questions, why we are asking those serious questions.
Okay, let's do it.
And then we talked, I think it was last time again, we expressed one of the reasons these questions become important in Islam, because when you look at the tradition by itself, let's say what Bukhari says or what Quran says, what Sīrah says, you get to ask questions of how can this be, because at that time this thing was not even existed. For example, like you talk about quite a lot about Mecca, Quran brings up Mecca, Hadith brings up Mecca, Muslims invest a lot of money every year to go there and then do their Hajj things. Yet, if you just take it in face value, it makes you ask the question, well, how can you talk about Mecca while historically this place was not even there? So therefore, it becomes important what manuscripts you have, what your manuscript says, can we trust them, are they reliable? And we are going to go to dig into the manuscripts, break it down, and then Jay, can you practice and speak a little bit slower for people to follow it up?
Let's do that. In fact, if you hear me going too fast, just interrupt me and say,
I am
Jay.
trying. It's not working at all.
I will be your obedient servant for this next hour. How long are we going? For an hour, hour and a half?
Allah knows best. We'll see.
No, Jesus knows best. I don't care who Allah. There is no Allah, so don't put him in the picture. Otherwise, we're going to go for 6, 7, 8 hours. He knows nothing.
Okay. So I'm gonna put your PowerPoints. I am the one who is in charge of the PowerPoint. So you tell me to move the next slide, I'll do so.
I've taken out all the animations, so just every time I say hit the button, that means go to the next slide.
Okay. And meantime, those of you who are watching us, please feel free to bring up your questions. Put @ in front of DCCI Ministries. I'll get to see it. And then while we have Dr. J. Smith, we can simply put him in hot seat and then make sure he answers our questions if we still have questions. Ready? Jay, are you ready?
I am, yes.
Okay. This is the first slide.
Okay, let's go ahead, and this is the question we're asking. The new historical critique on Islam's origins. Why in the world even are we asking this question? Go ahead for the next slide. This historical polemics, what are we talking about? Now, here's the problem. Islam is the second largest religion in the world and one of the most missionary-minded religions, and certainly the most polemical against Christianity. There's no other religion that is as large and is as vociferous and antagonistic towards Christianity as Islam today. Today, I'm not talking about in the past, I mean today. So Islam, therefore, is a religion that most people don't realize is much more than just a private faith. It's an entire way of life, so which impacts everything that Muslims do 24/7. So everything that they do, whether or not they are talking, eat, drinking, their political structures, everything they do impacts upon that. Therefore, and this is a big misnomer that many people in the West have. They think that Islam is something that only happens on Fridays in the prayers at the mosque. No, it is happening and I agree, Muslims are probably the best at really living out their faith every day of the week. So we need to put that on board, including what we're doing tonight. Even if you're to debate what we're doing tonight, that would be a religious act for a Muslim. And it should be the same for us. When we debate and defend Christianity, that should be a religious act for us. And that's why I love Muslims, because they are the best to model what we all should be doing as far as how we should live out our faith. Now, here's the problem. Islam has always been a religion that we thought was over there. It's not in Europe. It's not in America. It's really in the Middle East, with little bits more probably in Asia, but mostly in the Middle East. And we've always thought it's over there, therefore it's not our problem. That has now changed in my lifetime, especially since the Second World War, and especially since many Muslim countries have got their independence. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, most of your Muslim countries were no longer dependent on the colonial powers. 95% of the Muslim world was colonized by Christian countries. That no longer is the case. They've all become independent. And as a result of that, many of them are leaving their countries because they're fed up with Islam. Islam is just not working in their countries. And there's no way you can dispute that, Muslims. They're all coming our direction. And they're all coming to Europe, specifically Western Europe. Notice they don't go to Eastern Europe. They're not going to Hungary. They're not going to Poland. They're not going to any of the countries that don't have good welfare programs, or they were not colonial powers. They're coming to Western Europe, and more than not, they're coming to America, to my country, United States. They're coming in huge numbers. Just look at your elections that you had here in July in Britain. Now there are 11 cities that have Muslim mayors. Look at here in Britain and look and see. Britain has bent over backwards for Muslims. There are no restrictions against Islam in this country. I'm in Britain right now. I'm in London right now, though I don't live here. I'm here for a little while. And look and see just how much Britain has given the Muslims. There are no minaret bans. There are no burqa bans like there are in other parts of Europe. There are no restrictions. Britain is the only country in Europe, I think, outside of the Muslim world that has Islamic courts. Islamic courts, Sharia courts, over 100 of them in this country alone that are seen as legitimate courts underneath British law. So these are the things that are now coming. They're coming to us in a big way. Even where I am right now, I just went out today, and everywhere I see are Muslims, where they were not even here 7 years ago. They're everywhere now. And that's fascinating to me, because that means it's not a religion that we can say has something we can't deal with. It's something we don't need to deal with over there in Middle East. It's very much here. And of course, here in Britain, it's not even the Middle East. It's mostly Pakistanis, Indians, and Bangladeshis. So it is a religion that does not assimilate well. I saw that today. They don't assimilate well. Here in Britain, they take over our schools, they take over our hospitals and our prisons, and they demand halal food for only them. And of course, those schools, hospitals, and prisons now only serve halal food. And they also demand that I just now understood it in one of the schools that one of our kids, not our kids, my personal kids, just yesterday said that every time they use the word Muhammad, they have to say, peace be unto him. Everybody has to say, peace be unto him at that school. They push their boundaries. They push themselves on the country that they move to. They do not assimilate well. And Muslims believe that their way of life and their religious culture must be introduced to wherever they go, even imposed on everyone. To me, I have to sit there and I have to scratch my head. They've just left Muslim countries that have been destroyed because of Islam, and now they want to reimpose on Britain, where they're running to, the very thing that they left. But nonetheless, because of that, we're not paying attention to that. And we in the church especially have only ever used one model to really engage with Muslims, and it's called the Irenic approach, or peace and reconciliation, or you might want to call it the grace method. But it has never, ever been anything that confronts Islam. We've never confronted anything. Everything that I see here in Britain, by all the church agencies, by all the mission agencies, is to find commonality with Islam, come along with Muslims, and find things that we have in common, and then assimilate to their paradigm, not to our paradigm, even though they're in our country. So it is time, I think, now that we need to start going the other direction, and we need to start introducing apologetics and polemics. Now, Hatun, you know that, I know that, but many of our hearers do not know that, and that's something that makes people uncomfortable. So what I'm going to do now, go next slide, I want to introduce this whole new paradigm called polemics. And of course, if you hit the next slide, I'm going to have to define terms.
Okay, so before I move to the next slide, I just want to add a couple of things you said. I'm grateful that Jesus Christ is my role model. And you expressed that how Muslims are kind of leaving their own countries and moving to the different countries. Saudi Arabia said they don't want them. Remember? Muslim country doesn't want their Muslim brothers and sisters. So therefore, they are moving.
Isn't that rather odd to you? Wouldn't Muslims be better in Saudi Arabia and in the Middle Eastern countries, the oil-rich countries that can certainly accommodate them? Why is it Muslims don't go to those countries? Because they speak the same language, they have the same culture, they share the same religion. Many of them even are from the same ethnic group. Why in the world are they coming to the West? We don't speak the same language, we don't have the same culture, and we certainly do not have Islam as our way of life here. Why do they want to come this direction? What is it that's so attractive about the West?
It is called dawah. They are coming here for dawah. A couple of years ago, Muslim missionary Adnan Rashid was expressing that's why we go to West. Remember, President of Turkey expressed that go to Europe and then make babies to conquer Europe. So that's one of the reasons that they travel.
Define dawah. Not many people know what you mean.
So
dawah, what does it mean?
Yeah, dawah is you go and then force Islam upon people and then make them to say shahada, but you don't tell them like, oh, if they leave Islam that you will kill them. You just like make people Muslim, or you do love jihad, which is intentionally going after non-Muslim women, and just before you get married with them, you say, okay, convert to Islam, and then we will be happy, and then you force them into Islam with that way called the love jihad. People who are watching the program, I'm sure they are very much aware of those terms. So
you've unpacked this well in a lot of your videos. But dawah means to invite. It just means to invite. So it would be their equivalent to what we call evangelism.
Yeah, but we don't do evangelism so that God kind of gives us good points. We do evangelism because
you're right. I'm not saying we do. You're right. You're correct.
Muslims do dawah because their sins are just so outrageous. Allah kind of had them with their getting rid of their sins, so they get barakah.
To be fair, to be fair, there are many other Muslims that come here for economic reasons or for schooling reasons or because they love the freedoms that we have here. There are many more jobs here than in their own countries, which to me is rather curious. Why is it that our countries that are supposed to be so evil and so heinous and don't follow Muslim model are so much better and so much more attractive economically? Why is it the economy works here?
Are you telling me that Sharia finance is not doing good job? So Muslims,
you know good and well Sharia finance doesn't work, and that's why Sharia finance is not even applied very well. It has always been proven to be a failure. That's a whole nother subject we could go on.
So in Muslim countries, Islam is not working. They are going non-Muslim countries. In Muslim countries, they are not even giving any rights to the non-Muslims. So they are coming to Europe or going to America and having the rights which they don't even give to non-Muslims in their own countries. That's something should all concern us.
Okay, let me ask you this real quickly, since we're on the whole thing of the economy. What has any Islamic country produced that the rest of the world wants, except oil? Outside of oil, what has any Muslim country produced that the rest of the world wants? What cars have they produced? What airplanes have they produced? Their food we like, but you can get their food even in Christian backgrounds, because many of the best cooks are not Muslim. Many of them are Christian. But what is it they really produce? That anything that's technological, what is it and where is it we like to go? Most people, you can see there is hardly anything. What Nobel Prizes have they won in science or technology or in medicine? Do you see what I'm saying? So much of Islam just doesn't produce anything that the rest of the world wants. And that's one reason why they're coming to where the rest of the world produces. We are the producers in the Asia, but mostly in non-Muslim Asia and Europe and United States and Australia. We produce so much more for the world. We have created so much more for the world. And that's a huge attraction. And that's why it's so important that people point that out. They're all coming our direction because we do have jobs here and we do have skills here and we will train you up. But that's why they don't go to their own countries at least their own religious background countries, because there's nothing there for them unless, of course, you want to go and work as a servant in those countries. You're not going to give many jobs. And you can see even the oil producing countries are very careful not to have refugees come their way. All the refugees come our way. Now, here's the other thing. Notice what creates refugees. It's not economic plight. It's mostly violence. It's usually wars. When there is violence, people flee the violence. Notice how many refugees are coming from Muslim countries versus other countries, because almost every Muslim country has either problems with themselves internally or problems with their neighbors. That's what creates refugees. Oh, there goes the stars behind me. That's an apple. It loves what I'm doing. Every once in a while, it just shoots up all kinds of firecrackers behind me. But that's fascinating that Muslims haven't asked that question. Why, if Islam is such a great religion, aren't people going towards Muslim countries? Why, if Islam is so great a religion, aren't they producing things that other people want? Why, if Islam is such a great religion, that they are at the forefront? Why, at the forefront of all of the greatest discoveries? Why, if Islam is such a great religion, is there so much violence there? And unlike other places like Judeo-Christian cultures, where the violence is not nearly, we have internal violence on the streets, and we do have certain, I'm not suggesting that America is not violent, but even with the violence we have in our inner cities, people still want to come in their millions. We've had 11 million that have just walked across the border in the last 3.5 years to get to America. What is it? Where is the attraction there? And why are so many Muslims wanting to leave their countries, leave their culture, and then bring their culture and their religion with them and not assimilate into the cultures that they're running to? To me, I've always asked that question, and I've never heard a Muslim that can respond. Maybe someone could do so tonight. Let's see. But that's not really what we're here about. This is still an introduction.
And also, I wanted to make a point on Sharia councils you mentioned. So in England, we've got registered 85 Sharia councils. And we don't know, this is a very important point, we don't know about non-registered ones. We know that Sharia councils are running and running and running, but they are not registered and government doesn't even know of them. That should be concerning us all. Okay, next slide.
Now, so polemics. This is, and let me define terms, since I said I would do that. We have what we call apologetics and polemics, and it's basically like a football team. Now, let's use European football. Most of you who are in Europe, you do follow a team. I hope you do. If you don't, shame on you, because it's a great sport. But remember, on the football team, you have, go ahead.
If they're going to follow football team, they need to follow Sunderland.
Right. Sunderland it is. For me, it's Chelsea. So let's just use Chelsea since I'm the one talking. And my sons will probably turn me off if they hear that because they hate Chelsea. But Chelsea has both defense and offense. You have your defensive players so that they keep the others from scoring. You need your defensive players, and that's what we call apologetics in Christianity or in theological debate. You always defend against the attacks coming your way. And that's what defenders do. And they have a completely different set of skills. They tend to be big. They tend to be brawny. They tend to be strong. And they are able to put up walls to keep others from breaking down that walls to score the goal. But that's not how you win games. You don't win games with defense. The best defense is a good offense. And Vince Lombardi was the one that was famous for saying that. What that means is rather than always defending, which is what we do as Christians all the time, the best way to score goals, the best way to win the game is to have an offense. The midfielders, the strikers, they are the ones that actually make the goals. They are the ones whose names you know. They are the Christian Ronaldos of the world. They are the Neymars. They are the Lionel Messi's of the world. They are the ones that have the biggest salaries. They are the ones that are the celebrities. They are the ones that of course, are the ones in the papers at the very next day, because they are the ones that win the game. Now, on the offense in Christianity or in debate or whenever you're having discussion, offense is what we call polemics. So apologetics is defense, polemics is offense, and you need both end. In Christianity, we're great at defense, but we're absolutely hopeless at offense. And that's why most of you have never heard this word before. We just don't use polemics because people are fearful of being it's not Christ-like. Christ was never polemical. Well, I have to say, when people say that to me, I say, have you read his life? Have you seen what he was doing in the temple, overturning the tables in the temple and throwing out those animals that were being sold in the temple? That's called polemics. Look at Matthew chapter 23, verse 13 to 33. The entire chapter is on polemics. You hypocrites, you den of vipers, you white sepulchres, over and over and over again. Jesus was using polemics, but probably the best example of polemics would be Paul. Paul, who was Saul first and then became Paul. Paul is the best example. If you want to see what Paul did, just read Acts, the book of Acts, chapter 17, 18, and 19. He goes into Laodicea. He goes into Berea. He goes into Cappadocia. He goes into Ephesus. And the first thing he did in every one of these cities, he didn't make friendships. He never even learned the names of the people in the synagogues he went to. He didn't ever go and knock on the door and say, could I come in? He just walked in uninvited, went right up to the Pharisee, who is the head of the synagogue, and he confronted him. That's called polemics. He confronted him with words. Polemics means to go to war with words. Let me repeat that. Going to war with words, not with weapons of this world, like Paul says. We don't use weapons of this world in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul says very clearly, we use principalities and powers. And then verse 5 of 2 Corinthians 10, he says we use arguments, and we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Jesus Christ. Arguments means polemics. Look at Paul's example when he was there in Ephesus. He was there in Ephesus in chapter 19, and he was there in the synagogue, and they would not listen to him. He had confronted them with what they had done to the Messiah. They would not listen to him, so he finally left the synagogue, took the shoes from his feet, dusted the dust from his shoes, meaning symbolically, I'm having nothing more to do with you in the synagogue, and he went down to the lecture hall of Tyrannus. It's there today. The lecture hall of Tyrannus is a debating chamber. What do you do in debates? You use polemics. And it says for 2 years, he had spent 3 months in the synagogue. For the next 2 years, he debated. So much so that according to Acts 19, the entire land, the entire region had heard the gospel. Now, that's what Paul did. Why aren't we doing the same? The reason is this. Look and see what happened when Paul did this. He got hated. He got persecuted. He got thrown in jail. He got whipped twice. They tried to stone him to death. He caused a riot in Ephesus, and finally they killed him in Rome. So when you use polemics, you're going to be hated and persecuted. You're going to be put in jail. You're going to be flogged. And yes, you will be killed. Now, I've just used 5 categories. Did you notice? I did that intentionally because that is in Matthew 10. Matthew 10, Jesus is commissioning the 12 disciples. He's going to send the 12 disciples out into the world. And what does he say? This is their commission. He turns to the disciples and he says, if you go in my name, I'm sending you out as lamb before wolves. If you go in my name, you're going to be hated. How many of you have been hated? Well, Hatun, you've been hated. I've been hated. If you go in my name, you're going to be persecuted. How many of you have been persecuted? I've been persecuted. So have you, Hatun, in a very big way. You're going to be jailed. Hatun, you've been put in jail. You just won an award against the Metropolitan Police, 10,000 pounds, because you were falsely arrested, and you've been arrested 4 times. That's exactly what Christ promised is going to happen to you. You're going to be flogged. Hatun, you have been flogged. I have been hit, but nothing like you have. You have been flogged many more times than me. And then finally, number 5, you will be killed. That's the 5 things Jesus promised the disciples in their commissioning of them. And then he says in verse 34, I have not come to bring peace. I have come to bring the sword, to set father against son and mother against daughter. It's going to happen in your own family, he's saying. And then verse 38, he said, he who is not willing to bear my cross is not worthy to be my disciple. I don't know of a better commissioning. That should be the commissioning for all of us. If it's good enough for Paul in the 1st century, it's good enough for us, Hatun, you and me, in the 21st century. So that's why people don't want to use polemics. They're scared to death that they will have to receive that commissioning. And I say, folks, that's been the example of the church for the last 2,000 years. It's just in the 21st century, we're not reading our Bible anymore. We're not going to scripture anymore. We're not looking at the example of the church. Listen, of those 12 disciples, every one of them was hated. Every one of them was persecuted. Every one of them was thrown into jail. Every one of them was flogged. Every one of them, except for John, was killed. Let me repeat that. All 5 of those standards that Christ said was going to happen to them happened to every one of the disciples except for John. They received their commissioning. It should be normal for us to therefore use polemics, to go on the offense, to do what Paul did, to do what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did. All of them, they were all involved in this. And that's why, and today, polemics is a word most people don't understand, don't even know. I would imagine some of you who are listening to me have never heard it before. Now, when you unpack polemics, that means going on the offense. There are 3 kinds of polemics. I'm going to introduce them now. I've done it before. Some of you know where I'm going with this. One, the first kind of polemics is what you do, Hatun. You did that when you were introducing this whole episode. Internal polemics starts from the standpoint that you take the Quran, you open its pages, you read what's in the book, you look at it internally, you look at what it says, and then you confront many things that you read. You confront the contradictions, you confront the historical anachronisms, you confront the scientific errors, you confront a lot of the theology, you confront the morality, you confront the violences in the Quran, you confront the misogyny. This is called internal polemics. The same thing you do with Muhammad. You look at Muhammad's life, and you've done a great job. You and David Wood and Sam Shamoun, you are 3 of the best, where you have confronted who Muhammad was, what he did, what he said, and how irrelevant it is for the 21st century. It was even irrelevant in the 7th century. That's called internal polemics. You're using what you see in front of us internally. You look and see what Muslims claim as their book and their man, and you confront their book and you confront their man. That's the first kind of polemics. Number 2 is cultural polemics. You do that all the time. I do that. I don't do internal polemics anymore. That's why I didn't say much when that introduction was happening at the beginning of this program. For me, that's no longer valid for me. But cultural polemics looks at Islam today and looks and see what it's doing in Saudi Arabia, what it's doing in Bahrain, what it's doing in Timbuktu, what it's doing in Bangladesh, what it's doing in Indonesia, what Muslim communities are doing here in Britain, and looks at the culture in the 21st century and shows how irrelevant they are, shows how they are completely destroying the social structure, the fabric of those cultures. That's called cultural polemics. And you've done an awful lot of that on your show, looking and see how idiotic this is. You were talking the sexual jihad that they do. That is what's happening today in Muslim cultures, and how that needs to be shut down, that needs to be stopped, and it needs to be shown to the world. That's the second kind of polemics. I don't do as much as you do on this, but I say as many people that can, we need to show the testimony, the witness of Islam, what a terrible testimony they are, and what a terrible witness they are for their religion. But they have no other choice. They're just following what this book says. So in some ways, cultural polemics comes out of internal polemics. What the Quran says, they do. What Muhammad did, they do. What Muhammad said, they say. So because of internal polemics, cultural polemics flows from it. Now the third polemics doesn't even look at the Quran. I don't really care dilly swat. I don't need to open one page of it. I don't read one verse. I'm not interested in what the Quran says. I'm not interested on what Muhammad said or did. I am only interested in asking a much deeper question, a much more simple question, and that is, did Muhammad exist historically? Was there a Quran in the 7th century? Was there a city called Mecca in the 7th century? This is looking externally, looking historically, and seeing whether or not any of this edifice of Islam, the origins of Islam, actually happened. And basically it's asking, how did Islam begin? So it's not looking at the Quran. We're not looking at the pages of the Quran. We're not looking at what Muhammad did to women or what he did to those who opposed him. We're not looking at the violence that he perpetrated. We're not looking at any of that. We're not even looking at what Islam's doing today. What we're asking is a much deeper question, and in some ways a much more damaging question. Why in the world are we even talking about this religion in the 21st century if it never has any foundations to begin with? No historical foundations. Now you can see those are three different kinds of polemics. All three are needed, but some people are much better at the internal critique. You're much better at that than I am, Hatun. Some are much better at cultural polemics because they're much more aware of what's happening around the world. You're much better at that than I am. And others are much better at the external polemics. That's my area of expertise. I'm much better at that than you are. And that's why you called me on this show, because this talk is about external polemics. Now we're getting into the historical critique, asking, did Muhammad actually exist? So let's go to the next slide, unless you have something more you want to add.
It is good to see in the body of Christ, since solution to the problem of Islam is Lord Jesus Christ, and it is good to know and see in the body of Christ we've got brothers and sisters who uses different approach to challenge the ideology of Islam as well as preach the gospel. So that's always like very, very good.
So the historical polemics. Now we're going into the third one. So what do we do in the third form of polemics, the historical polemics? Well, basically, we confront three things. It's as simple as that. We only confront three things: one book, one man, one place. The book, of course, is the Quran. The man is Muhammad, and the place is Mecca. Now, I usually, though I say the book, the man, and the place, I actually, when I do this, I turn it backwards. I go backwards, and I start with Mecca. So we confront Mecca historically. Was there a place called Mecca in the 7th century, or even before? Because obviously Muslims have to say yes, because that's where Adam and Eve were sent at the very beginning of time. So therefore they are the first man, first woman. So sent down to Mecca, it's the very first place in existence. It's the oldest inhabitant for mankind. So they would have to say yes, it existed long before the 7th century. What about Muhammad himself? The Muhammad of Islam, the Muhammad. You notice I'm emphasizing three vowels. That Muhammad, did that Muhammad exist? The Muhammad of Islam, who lived in Mecca and also then moved to Medina. And then, of course, we are asking whether or not this book here, the one I have in my hand, was this book in existence in the 7th century, because that's what every Muslim tells us. It was created in a period of 22 years between 610 to 632. That's the 7th century. So we're asking, okay, prove it. Where is this book that was supposedly put together during the time of Muhammad's life, but actually written down during the time of Uthman in 652? So the conclusion, this form of polemics confronts the very foundations of Islam without confronting the people or their revelation or their prophet, and lowers the anger. I don't get death threats anymore for doing this third form of polemics. I don't get strikes on my YouTube channels anymore. People meet me on the streets and they sit there and they're just quizzical. I don't get threatened anymore because I'm not in any way causing anybody anger. When this fellow Lars said, "Are you hating us?" I got to laugh when he said, "What have we said that's hateful tonight?" You won't see, I'm not going to say anything against Muhammad. What a waste of time. I don't want to talk about him. I'm not going to say anything against the Quran. What a waste of time. I'm not going to even read from one of its pages. I haven't said anything against Muslims. What a waste of time. I love them. Why would I say anything against them? All I'm going to ask is that book, That Man in That Place, in the 7th century? If I can prove just one of those three things did not exist in the 7th century, the other two come falling down. All you have to do is, like a stool with 3 legs, shut down and destroy one of those legs and the other two collapse. Because if there was no place called Mecca, then I don't care what Muhammad you find, I don't care what Quran you find, if it's not from Mecca, it's no longer the man, the prophet, or the book of Islam, because Islam absolutely is dependent on Mecca for the other two. If I can shut down Muhammad, then I don't care what Quran or what city you find. If Muhammad's not there, then the other two fall as well. And that's why if you take the Quran away from both Muhammad and Mecca and find that the Quran we do have is from much further north, and we can pretty much put it together and find where it's also originated, but none of it is from Mecca, written by a man named Muhammad. It's written over a period of hundreds, maybe thousands of years. Then it shuts down both Muhammad and Mecca. So that's why these three are by far the most important areas of Islam. Islam is absolutely dependent on one book, one man, and one place. Now stop and think, Hatun. So are we. We start from the same paradigm. We also have a man. We also have a book. We also have a place. And you take out any one of those three. If you take away from Jerusalem, then there was no crucifixion. Then there was no Jesus. In fact, there was no Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There was nothing. Christianity couldn't have existed without Jerusalem. If you take away Jesus, then we're all damned. And then there's no crucifixion and there's no resurrection. And then we might as well throw out the New Testament if there was no Jesus. And if you take out our book, if you take out the New Testament and eradicate it and show that it didn't exist in the 1st century, then it doesn't matter what Jesus you find, doesn't matter what Jerusalem is there, it's no longer the Jesus that died on the cross and rose again. That's why, in some ways, we have exactly the same paradigm, the same model that Islam has. They are dependent on a book, we're dependent on a book. They are dependent on a man, we're dependent on a man. They are dependent on a city, we are dependent on a city. But what a better book, what a better man, and what a better city we have. And that's why we're having this discussion tonight. You want to come back on any of that?
So we are focusing on whether under the can we trust Islam or not. You are making a point that so we should able to have the Mecca, which has been mentioned in Islamic sources, exactly the same from the historical perspective, dated in 7th century. And you are even saying, okay, it needs to be before that because Adam was sent to Mecca and Abraham built it stuff. And then you are saying,
verse 24, when she was thrown, they were thrown out of the garden, even up in space. Where was Eve thrown to? She was thrown to Mecca, according to the traditions.
Yes.
Where did Abraham live in chapter 21, verse 51 to 71 in the Quran? At the Masjid al-Haram. Every Muslim knows, as far as they're concerned, the Masjid al-Haram is the Kaaba, Mecca. Therefore, Abraham is there rebuilding the Kaaba. So that's 1900 BC. That's long before the 7th century AD.
So we are focusing on place, the person, and the book, which Muslims put their faith in 21st century, if that is exactly what was in 7th century. So Muhammad, the Muslims read and believe and put their kind of hope in him, is that Muhammad was existed and working actively from 600 murdering or 610 to 632. That's what we are looking for.
And
Same
why? Because they make that claim. We don't make that claim. They make it. Since they make the claim, they've got to prove it.
Okay, so we are looking at what Muslims today claim and believe about Mecca, Muhammad, and the Quran. Was that exactly the same in 7th century? We are kind of much more narrowing down to before 632.
Yeah, but I'm only really interested in the 7th century and before. I'm not interested in after the 7th century, because after the 7th century, you're too late. You've got to prove from the 7th century these three existed.
Okay, also remember, you those of you who are watching, Jay already made a point that Muslims have zero to no excuse that they shouldn't have anything written down at that stage. They were in power, they were controlling, they have the financial support as well. So they have zero to no reason that nothing should be wait until centuries later or until decades later. Keep that in mind as well. Okay, let's move to the next slide.
Now, normally whenever I do this talk, I go into 4 areas. It really covers 4 areas because it's more than just the book, The Man and the Place. It's also the sources. What about the sources for the book, The Man and the Place? So I usually start out with that area. Now, I'm not going to do that tonight. If you want to know about the sources or about Mecca or about the Quran, just watch my videos. They're all up on Fander Films. You can see all those arguments laid out there. They're also on Sīrah International, Al-Fadi's site. Tonight, let's just look at 2 areas confronting Muhammad's existence. I'm more interested today. I just want to take this because this is a precursor to what we're going to be doing next week with Robert Spencer. So this is confronting Muhammad's existence. Where do we get our sources for Muhammad? And who was he exactly? And let's go now to that map. Now, according to the standard Islamic narrative, this is their narrative. This is not me speaking. This is what Muslims tell us. They say that when Muhammad died, all that was under his control was in that brown area. So that's Muhammad's empire up to 632. And you can see it just covers mainly Mecca and Medina, the Hijaz, which is that area where Mecca, Medina is, a little bit north, about as far up as Tabuk, and then down to what is today Yemen and the Hadramaut back then. So it's a very small area that he controlled when he died. And really, he really only stayed within Mecca and Medina, according to their traditions. Now, he had raids outside, but he didn't go further north than that brown area. He didn't go further east than that brown area. Now, you can see there's a little bit of brown over in Oman. There were those that also, they say that the part of Oman was under his control. When he died in 632, then you had the 4 rightly guided caliphs. Abu Bakr from 632 to 634. You then had, he died peacefully. And then after that was Umar from 634 to 644. He only lasted 10 years and he was killed. And then you had Uthman come to power from 644 to 656. He only lasted 12 years and then he was killed. And then Ali comes in and he only lasts 5 years and then he is killed. So it wasn't a very peaceful time. Nonetheless, that's the golden era of Islam, and they call it the Rashidun period. Look at the map. Now look at the orange area there. That's where they expanded their borders. So it existed all the way from Tripoli. I'm sorry, this way. Tripoli in the west, all the way over to what we would call today Afghanistan in the east, and then from Turkey in the north all the way to Yemen in the south. So it was a large area. It was the second largest power of its day at that time, up until 661. 661, so we're just talking roughly about 30 years. Once Ali was killed by Muawiyah at the Battle of Siffin, then the Umayyad Caliphate came into power, and they then expand the borders all the way up to this direction, all the way over to Spain, way over in the west, all the way to India in the east, Turkey in the north, and Yemen in the south. So a huge expanse. That's the purple area. I'm not interested in the purple area because that's too late. I'm really only interested in the brown and the orange area. That's all we're going to talk about tonight.
Okay, just a quick note. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad did not die peacefully. That's important. He suffered for 3 years after he has eaten cooked lamb. He suffered for 3 years and then he had lots of pain before he died. beside Abu Bakr, all of the caliphs, which Jay mentioned, remember, they were murdered by other Muslims, not other Romans, not pagans or anyone. They were murdered within Islamic circle. And people were just like, Muslims were fighting with other Muslims groups. So I wouldn't call that peaceful, but I just wanted people to kind of keep in their mind, within 30 years after the death of Muhammad, Muslims are fighting with one another for the power.
4 of the 5 caliphs were killed. You're right.
Yeah.
Only
they were murdered by other Muslims.
Yeah.
It's not very peaceful at all.
And it's still happening today. It's still happening today. You're right.
Yeah,
so that's
another
golden period of Islam. If that's the golden period of Islam, I want nothing to do with it. But Muslims don't seem to pick that up. So it's good you're bringing that point out. Thanks so much, Hatun, for doing that. Okay. Anything else you want to say about this?
No, that's okay. I can see very peacefully they kind of conquered.
Yeah. So here's the problem. The problem with Muhammad. That's all we're going to talk about tonight. Go to the next slide. What we need to do is follow the evidence. Now, this is what Muslims claim, not me. This is what they claim. Muhammad, they claim, of Islam, was the last and greatest prophet who lived in Mecca between 570 when he was born there up until 622 when he then moved up to Medina and died in Medina 10 years later in 632. Again, as you say, he was poisoned, so he didn't die peacefully. He modeled, but he is the model for Islam as the paradigm for the whole world. And that's what everybody wants to follow. During that time, from 610 to 632, when he finally died, he received the Quran, this book here, as a final revelation for the whole world. Now, everything we need to know about him can be found in 2 real sources. One is called the Sīrah of Ibn Hisham, who died in 833. That's the 9th century. And the other is the Hadith of the Hadith compilations of Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi, and the others. 6 major hadiths between 870 and 915. So that's the 9th and 10th century. Unfortunately, these references are all in the 9th and 10th centuries, 200 to 300 years after the fact. So that's the problem right there. We just don't have anything from his time period. We have nothing written down by those who actually knew him, saw what he did, and heard what he said, like we have for Jesus Christ. None of that exists. There's nothing like we have for Jesus Christ. And now we're talking 600 years later. There is no reason for them not to have anything written down because these are all califal courts. So the question is this: is this later Muhammad of Islam really referred to in the 7th century? Is there any reference to him? If he did exist and he had that much control and he had so much influence, if he was that great as the greatest prophet in the history of mankind, is there any, or living in a place called the Hijaz, do we have anything at all that supports that? That's all we're asking. Did he do the things he's purported to have done? That's all we're asking. So let's look at the historical record of Muhammad and of Islam to answer that question. That's a simple question. This is not hateful by asking that question. Lars, are you hearing? I hope you're still there. We're not being hateful by asking a simple question. If that's hateful, then we might as well just throw up and walk away. There can't be any question asked of anything. Thank God we have the freedom. And it looks like Lars must not be from the West. And that looks like Said is already saying. Now, I'm not even gone into it. I've only repeated what you're telling me, Said. So where have I lied? I haven't even got into the historical critique yet. And he's already calling me a liar. I would like to know where I've lied. It's fascinating. This is the only recourse that Muslims have, and it's called ad hominem.
Maybe he doesn't believe Muhammad lived in Mecca.
Okay, so I'm lying. There was the Muhammad. He's already agreed to it. Bingo. We'll throw it right back at him if he really thinks I'm lying. So these are the Muslim claims, Said. Are you hearing me? We're talking about what you're telling us, and you're already calling me a liar. Now, here's what's interesting. We've been told, and you've heard me say this so many times, haven't you, Hatun? I mean, I've been saying this for years, that everything we know about what he did, that's his biography, not what he said, what he did, known as the Sīrah, that was written by Ibn Hisham, and he died in 833. Now, Alfred Guillaume has the book, the standard book that we all read. I've got a copy, and not here, but back home. You've got a copy of it, that dark green book, and it says Ibn Ishaq is the one that actually wrote it down, but Ibn Hisham got it from the students of Ibn Ishaq. And Ibn Ishaq, as you're going to see in this map here. Yeah, let's go to that. Let's go to that next screen. So what we've been told is that the Sīrah, that's the green one, the biography of Muhammad, was not written down during Muhammad's lifetime. He died in 632. It doesn't get written down until 833 or just before. So about 20 years before 833, but it's still in the 9th century, because most people write down during as they're getting to an old age, like myself, and then you keep adding to it and finding when you die, that's when it stops. So that's why we always put their death dates. That's why we put Muhammad's death date. We don't talk about when it started beginning his revelation. We talk about the end of his revelation. That's why we put 632. And that's why I put his death date. So obviously assume that we're talking about 20 years prior to 833. We have also Al-Waqidi, who is the one that wrote about the Maghazi, the raids of Muhammad. Again, isn't that interesting? He was only interested in the violence of Muhammad. Muhammad had so many raids, and he was involved in 29 of them, and planned another 33 on top of that, according to Al-Waqidi. And that all happened within the last 10 years of his life. So you can see all happened while he was in Medina. So that's what we get. Look at the dates from those two green reference points there. Ibn Hisham, Al-Waqidi, their biography are written in the 9th century. That's 200 years after the fact. Now then we get to the Hadith. The Hadith are the same, much more prolific, much larger. Go ahead.
Can I just step in? So, am I right to understand you are stating that no one ever wrote the biography of Muhammad before Ibn Hisham?
We don't have any. Where is it? Tell me. Give me one. Okay,
so you are saying, are you saying no one wrote it, or you are saying if someone wrote it, we don't have it?
We don't have it. That's all I'm saying. And Muslims have, if Muslims can correct me, Said, if you want to come back and say I'm lying, then show me. What biography are you talking about that predates Ibn Hisham? That's the biography, and it's the one that we all read. It's the one that you read. It's the one that we're all told to read. It's the only one that you can get, and that's the biography of Ibn Hisham. Al-Waqidi does exist, but not many people read it because there's not much there to read about. It's really, you want to know what Muhammad did. You want to know about his life as a child, his life as he grew up in Mecca, and then he moved to Medina. So if this is the case, then we need to ask, where is Ibn Hisham's material? And we're going to get to that. But before we do that, let's look at the Hadith. This is what they say. Are Said there still there? Said, this is you saying this, not me.
Let me just bring up a question. If we have historians that wrote about this guy named Jesus, then the foragers, I don't know what is this word. Forager.
The travels, maybe.
Maybe.
The foraging in Jerusalem.
Okay. He made in Jerusalem. Wouldn't be historians mentioning Muhammad in Mecca?
Exactly. Great point, Viking lady. That's exactly what we're saying. Why is it that we can go to people like Thales and Phlegon, who are Greek satirists, who are talking about Jesus in 52 AD? 20 years after Jesus died, you had two satirists who are debating about his death. And they were mentioning on the day that Jesus died that the earth shook and the sun went dark. That's within 20 years. These are not Christians. These are outside satirists. What about Josephus, who is a Jewish historian? He is writing at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. He's living in Rome, and he mentions Jesus by name, and he mentions the crucifixion. He also mentions that some Christians believe that Jesus rose again. Now, that's a Jewish historian writing about Jesus within the 1st century of Jesus's death. And then probably the best one that I could go to many others, but let me just do with the three of them. Let's go to the Roman historian, Tacitus. Tacitus absolutely hated Christians. He had nothing good to say about Christians. He thought them as a scourge on the empire. But he was a Roman, and he wrote about the death of Jesus. And he said that the death of Jesus happened during the time of Pontius Pilate under the authority of Tiberius. That's why we know today that it happened in 33 AD. He is the one that dates it for us. So I've just given you a Greek satirists, I've given you Jewish historian, and I've given you a Roman historian, none of which are Christian. They would have no reason to dispute his existence or even mention him if Jesus hadn't existed. But Muslims should not be asking that, because Muslims know Jesus existed. He's all through their Quran 93 times. So why would Muslims claim that he didn't exist? It's only secular people that make that claim. But today, that's no longer viable. But notice, I still want to get back to what Muhammad said, because those are the bigger, much greater, those are the much more prolific support for Muhammad. And these are known as the Hadith. I have them in blue there. That's why it's a completely different genre than the Sīrah, which is the biography. Now, the blue parts, notice I have Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawud, and Nasai. Notice when you ever hear these names, when Muslims claim them, they never put dates to them. I purposely put dates to them. This is what Muslims don't like about me. They always hate it whenever I put dates up there. And I then put it on a timeline. Look at the timeline at the bottom. I put that there in purposely so that you can see exactly what we're talking about. Look at these dates of Bukhari, 870, Muslim, 875, Tirmidhi, 884, Majah, 887, Dawud, 899, An-Nasai, 915. These are all 9th and 10th century. That's 240 to almost 300 years after Muhammad. So can you see, none of these men knew Muhammad. They never heard him say one word. They don't even live in the same century as Muhammad. They live 200 to 300 years later. That's why I have them on a timeline. This is what Muslims hate. They hate the timelines that I have. I have to put it up there because we demand that of Jesus Christ. We demand that of any historical figure. Put them on a timeline. I've been having Muslim after Muslim getting up there and putting up these videos, and they pick out a book here and say, Jay, here I have a biography of Muhammad. He is much earlier. Here's a hadith of Muhammad, that what he said, he's much earlier. But they never give me a timeline. They never give me a date. They just grab them off their shelves. They don't even look to see what the dates are. I'm getting sick and tired of Muslims doing that, because I could do that with Jesus. I could pick any book and I could just take it out and say, here's a book of Jesus's life, and it was written by Jesus himself. Why don't I? Here it is. Jesus, the coordinate method of Jesus. I could just put it up there and claim that this was written by Jesus. How can I be tested? You have to have a date. You have to be able to know that that manuscript exists. That's all we're asking. We've had to do that with Jesus. Therefore, Muslims now have to do that with Muhammad. So please, Muslims, don't come up to me and start claiming that you have all these other writings from all these Salafis and all these Tabi'uns, those who were actually with Muhammad, who were there hearing what he said, seeing what he did, and wrote down long before any of these guys that I have on this timeline. From as far as we're concerned, from what Muslims are telling us, this is their authority for Muhammad. Now, there's still two more genres, and that's the tafsir and the tariq, which I have in brown. The earliest that wrote the tafsir and the tariq, according to the Islamic narrative, not me, I'm not saying this, is Al-Tabari. And now there are many others that write after him. You have Baidawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, all of them come after 923. That's when Tabari died. So he was writing them at the beginning of the 10th century. But still, that's 300 years after Muhammad. I've gotten that graph there, Abdul Malik. I put him in there. You can see 692. 692 is the first time we see the word from Arab sources for the name Muhammad. Notice I didn't say Muhammad. I said Muhammad. You'll see why. You'll see why. Muhammad is not Muhammad. But that's introducing what I'll be doing later in these slides. And then I've also put the Abbasids there because they come into power about halfway through the 8th century, 749. And they are the ones that start introducing the Muhammad that we know today. That's why it's important that we put them on a timeline. But look how many years. Look at the conclusions at the top. Muhammad was revealed 84 years after the Abbasids created him, 141 years after he was first introduced, yet 200 years after he supposedly lived. These are all too late. Why am I saying that? Ibn Hisham, Al-Waqidi, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Al-Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawud, An-Nasai, Al-Tabari are all Abbasids. They are all Abbasids. None of them are Umayyad. That's why I'm trying to get this point across. You need to see the timeline. We're talking about the 8th century and later. 9th and 10th century. We have nothing from before this time except where Abdul Malik introduces it, as I'm going to talk about later on coins and also on the Dome of the Rock. All right. You want to add anything before we go to the next slide?
So you are saying we do not have the biography of Muhammad before Ibn Ishaq, and that's not survived anyway. We received it from Ibn Hisham.
Oh, we don't have Ibn Ishaq. In fact, that's why I have it in light green. And normally if I do an animation, he's off the screen by now. I've already thrown him out because there's nothing from Ibn Ishaq. What Muslims are telling us is that it is first introduced by Ibn Hisham 833 or 20 years earlier than that. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, so what is the reason that they kind of decided to write the biography of Muhammad?
Exactly. Obviously, this has to do with an agenda. They had to write it because they needed a backstory. I'm going to get to that. Once you create a prophet that's in contradiction to an earlier prophet or two references of two messiahs who are yet to come, and you create a third one, if you do that, you now have a prophetic line. You've got to create that prophetic line because you don't have a prophetic line if you're an Ishmaelite. Remember, these Mayas are all Ishmaelites. They are not from the line of Isaac. They're from the line of Ishmael. Now, as a result, once you then introduce that Muhammad, you then have to give him a story. That only begins to appear 70 years after the Abbasids come to power. They probably may have had something written by Ibn Ishaq. I don't know if they did or not. There could have been a historical Ibn Ishaq, but they obviously destroyed it because it wasn't good enough. That's why they had to go to Ibn Hisham. However, tonight, I'm going to throw everything out. Everything you're looking at right now is what I've been telling you for years. Am I correct, Hatun?
Let's say not fully, but anyway.
Is there anything else I've said that's different than what you're seeing on the screen right now?
No, so I've just kind of got a couple of more questions before you kind of move on.
All right.
Okay, so I'm not clear regarding the answer why after 200 years someone decides to come up with the biography of Muhammad.
Okay, can you hold on to that? We're going to answer that later on.
Okay. So what do you do with the writings? For example, Tabari talks about it, or he took like some of the stories from this person. Like you kind of simply reject them because we don't have anything to write from them, and they are oral tradition, or you just don't take Tabari as a kind of reliable source. For example, like I remember reading Tabari's talking about Urwa. So we don't have anything from him, but Tabari mentions that. So we ignore that because there is nothing to write from him, or because it is like all about oral tradition.
I'm just going to say the same thing that we have said that all of us have been asked of us, and that is we don't trust oral tradition. Therefore, you have to have something that's written down. But I'm going to get to that. I'm going to say about Al-Tabari. Now, let's just say this one real quickly. You notice, why is it so many people love Al-Tabari? Why do we love him?
No, it's not that I'm asking like they love or not. I'm just asking. So he talks about the.
Stop and answer that question then. Everybody loves Al-Tabari because he gives you so many contradicting stories. Am I correct?
That's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm just trying to make. So we kind of, as he talks about the Muhammad's customs, or let's say all the contradiction story he's talking about, are you simply rejecting them because nothing survived until that stage, or you are kind of rejecting them because you think that's oral tradition or not reliable?
I'm saying we don't know if anything about Al-Tabari ever really existed. However, I'm saying also, isn't it interesting, the one thing that you do have that everybody has to go to is Al-Tabari, yet he has contradictory story after contradictory story. He puts out almost everything out there, and he lets you decide which is the truth. Now, doesn't that tell you something? That looks like there's a huge amount of contradictory stories about what Muhammad said and did in Al-Tabari. But hold on a minute, hold on to that, because Al-Tabari had nothing to do with someone in the 10th century. Okay? Once I get to these next material, then you can start asking your questions. Because you're trying to jump the gun here, which is fine. I understand your impatience, but you know where I'm going with this, Hatun, because we did this about 3 weeks ago. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Anything else you want to say about this slide, though?
I would like to say my patience is quite high, Jay.
Good one, right? Then be patient. Now, the other problem is the location. And you've seen this before. This is nothing new that I'm not introducing something new here. I've said, notice that all these Abbasid writers, none of them were living and did their work down in a place called Mecca and Medina. They weren't even down in the area they should be to talk about who Muhammad was and what he said. They should be down at least where Muhammad lived and where Muhammad was speaking. But none of them are. They're living way up in Baghdad. They come from Cairo. They come from Tabaristan. They come from Bukhara. They come from Basra. That is 900 to 1200 to 2600 to 1700 miles away. Everything they did was from where the Abbasid area. And notice they're all up in the north. Why do you think they're up in the north and not down in the south? Yes, that's right, Phil. That's the narrative you're giving to me. That's the narrative everybody's heard. That's nothing new. You're right. Tabari contradicts history many times, like the seizing of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He has all kinds of problems, historical and otherwise. He has internal contradictions. He says one thing one here, then says just the opposite here, which people have always been curious as to why. I'm going to explain that. It's going to become much more clear, but we've got to get through the material that we're introducing. All right? Okay, so that's just to show you that everything was from much further north. It's coming from where there is water. Where there is water, there are people. Where there are people, there are towns, cities, civilizations, history. That's why you have to have history where there are people that are living. There was no one living that far south that would have had any idea as to what is happening. They wouldn't have any of these disputes going on that far south, because a place like Medina only had, according to the historians, only about 200 people lived there, and there wasn't even a Mecca that existed. So you can understand these are just small oases along the Western Plateau, since all of these material that are so full of theological disputes with Christians and with Jews and with pagans. You can't have theological disputes with Jews and Christians if there are no Christians and Jews to have them with. And there's no Christians and Jews that far south. They don't go further south than Tabuk, which is way up in north. What is it? Up in northern Arabia. So all of this, everything that you do find that is written by these men are way up in the north where these disputes are happening. But I'm going to say even less than that. I'm going to say these men had nothing to do with these disputes, nor with the writings they're credited for.
I guess at this stage you are also thinking they never traveled to Mecca or Medina.
I don't even think they existed.
Okay,
simple as that. I don't think they exist. Now, Mecca and Medina did exist by this period. By the time they were writing, by the 9th century, there was a Mecca, there was a Medina. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that they did not, that city didn't exist. Those cities didn't exist. And maybe by that time, there was also a thriving metropolis back down there. What I'm saying is, why aren't they down there? Why weren't they there in the 7th century? Not only are they hundreds of years later, they're hundreds of miles away. It stands to reason that if the center of Islam has always been Mecca and Medina, then what are all these guys doing way up in Baghdad? Now, the answer is because the Abbasids were in Baghdad. Go before that. What are the Umayyads doing in Damascus? Why are the Umayyads in Damascus and the Abbasids are in Baghdad if the whole center of the world is Mecca and Medina and has been since the time of Adam and Eve, where all the trade goes through? Everything that Muslims tell us about Mecca and Medina is that's where all the trade went through and controlled all the trade routes. It's where all of history happened. It's where the beginning of history happened. It's been going on since the time of Adam and Eve. It's where Abraham lived. It's where 300 prophets were buried. If that is the case, then why is nothing happening down there? And why are all of these men who are writing about this man Muhammad, why aren't they down there? Why aren't they where it all happened? What are they doing hundreds of miles away? Now, you might say, well, the same thing with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. No, we aren't. Notice that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Paul, they're all right where Jesus lived. They're all right where he was going, where he was speaking, where he lived, and where he did all his work. They were right there in the same place that Jesus lived and worked. Isn't that interesting that all of our traditional writers, because we have the same genre, we have the exact same genre as Islam has. We also have the Sīrah of Jesus, written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We also have the Hadith of Jesus, written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the red letter. We also have the Tafsir, which would be Paul's commentaries, the book to Ephesians, the book to Philippi, the book to Corinth, the two books to Corinth, the book to Rome. These are all written as the Tafsir that takes what Jesus said and unpacks it for each of those cities. So we have the same genre, and we also have the Tahqiq, which would be the history of the early church written by Luke. So we have the exact same genre that they have, but all of our writers were where it happened. They were all in and around Jerusalem, not hundreds of miles away and hundreds of years later. That's all I'm trying to say. So take that under bed, and you're going to see this gets even worse, though.
Okay. Wouldn't you say also impacts of so we are approximately 150 to 150 years after death of Muhammad. So Islam already took over these places. So there are individuals who are kind of at this stage they are Muslims, so they are just traveling to the Holy Land to learn more about their prophet, or traveling the Holy Land to figure out what is it.
Could well be. And I'm going to hold that in your lap, and you're going to see why that question is going to become ridiculous in just about another half hour.
Okay.
So, even these late dates, are they correct? Now we're getting into it. Here's the problem. Many Muslims point to book after book on their bookshelves. I've had so many Muslims who've been putting up videos against what I'm saying. And what do? Jay, you don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea. You're such an expert in Islam. Look at this book I have here. See? And they rattle off the name of a person. This is a Sahaba. This is one of those that knew Muhammad. Look at this book, the Muwatta of so-and-so, of al-Malik. Look at Muwatta al-Malik. He was a Tabi'un. He comes, and he was much earlier than Ibn Hisham. Look at this book here. You have no idea what you're talking about. And they start picking off all these books off these shelves, and they start naming these books after name, but they never date them. They never date them. And they say, I've got them on my bookshelf, which means they were actually published in the 21st century. Isn't that interesting? Why is it that these Muslims never name the dates? They never put the dates for any of those writings. And why is it that they never put the place of the person that they're writing about? That's why they hate it when I put dates on. That's why they're going to continue. That's why we're doing this tonight. You've got to put dates. I don't care what you find. You can name any name you want. You can give me your grandfather and say that he knew Muhammad. And should I believe you? I could put any person I want to and say that I come from Jesus's line. Well, not Jesus, he didn't have any children, but I come from the line of Mary. I could say that if I want to, and I was right. I have a great grandfather was right there that saw Jesus be nailed to the cross, and I heard what he said, and I was right there with the group of the 12. I could make that up and just claim that he was another disciple of Jesus. Ooh, what have I just said? We do have that. There are all kinds of writings like that. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the second epistle of Peter. All of these are the Gospel of Barnabas. These are all well-known documents, Gnostic writings, most of them, that are all claiming to be from people that actually knew Jesus, but written hundreds of years later. So that exists. There's all kinds of that kind of literature that are swimming around the world today that we know about. So that's why I'm saying be careful, Muslims. Don't just take things off the bookshelf and claim that these are people that predate what I'm going to put up there. Because I'm putting up there what you claim. Everyone, are you listening to science? I'm putting up your claims, not my claims. These are your claims. I'm taking you at value. So let's go on and say they take them off their bookshelves and they claim that they were written by those who knew Muhammad, that they saw what Muhammad did and heard what Muhammad said. But they never show us their original extant codices or manuscripts. They just put printed books that were printed in the 21st century. Many of them probably printed even last year. New ones that keep coming, being printed and are being put throughout the publishing world, especially in the Arab world. And they don't have any forensic evidence for any of them because there's no extant manuscripts. Nor do they ever give us any dates concerning when exactly those books were originally written, not the ones that are published today. I want to know when they were originally written. The Europeans have been the only ones that have done this. Muslims do not want to do this. And you can see why, because of what we're finding. To be valid witnesses for Muhammad, we must have these traditional writers' original extant manuscript. That means the manuscript in our hand. Extant means that we can handle, that we can look at, that we know actually exists, that it's in a library where we can touch. Not me, not you, though the experts can touch, all right? To look at, in order to know whether they really wrote what they are purported to have written. Otherwise, it's nothing more than hearsay. This is just like gossip. This is just like Chinese whispers. Remember, the compilers of the Prophet's life and his sayings all worked under the authority of the Muslim caliphs. So they would have had access to durable writing material, such as parchments and vellum. I said this earlier. In other words, using animal skins. Unlike our earliest Christian writings, which were all written on papyrus, non-durable leaves, because they were written by people who did not have power, did not have authority, and certainly did not have a lot of riches. Papyrus was the poor man's paper. So the Muslim writings were not from that genre. They were all written by people who were part of the courts of the caliph. They were not poor people. They had all the wealth at their disposal. So the Muslim writings should still be in existence even today, a mere 1400 years later. That's why I asked you about Constantine. Listen, you can go right here to the Bridback Gallery in British Library, and you can go and see the Sinaiticus there. It's right there on public display. It is from 325 AD, 300 years after Christ, but it was created, most people believe it was commissioned by Constantine, the emperor, for the Council of Nicaea. The Vaticanus in Rome is about the same time period, 325 to 350 AD. That's 300 years before the Quran even came into existence, before Muhammad even lived. We have two complete manuscripts of the New Testament alone, both here in London and one in Rome, that predate Muhammad by 300 years, written on parchment. So there's no excuse for Muslims not to have this in parchment form. If we can do it, why can't they do it? Especially since they claim that this is the best, the final, and that Allah protects his own word. That's in chapter 15, verse 9. Now, we also have the Alexandrinus right here in the British Library. That is from the 5th century. So three metropolitan codas, the Sinaiticus, the Vaticanus, and the Alexandrinus, complete parchment, complete New Testaments written on parchment, all from 200 to 300 years before Muhammad. We also have 365 manuscripts, either complete or partial, that exist before the 6th century. If we can come up with that, such a huge load of manuscripts that are still extant. These are extant manuscripts. You can put them in your hand. You can feel them. If we can provide that, can come up with that, why can't Islam, which was much more powerful, much bigger, and certainly a lot more wealthy than the church was when they were writing these books? So I'm asking Muslims, please, if you're going to make a claim, don't just pull these books off the bookshelf and say, this is from the time of the Sahaba. Let's find out what we know about the extant manuscripts that do exist. Let's look to the Sīrah. Let's start with the Sīrah, his biography. Then we'll go to the Hadith, his sayings. Then we'll go to the codices of the Sahabas, his companions. And then we'll go to the Tabi'uns, of the Sahaba and the Tabi'uns, the second generation. And then we'll end off with the Tariq and the Tafsir, his commentaries and the histories of Muhammad. So these are the genre that tell us about who Muhammad was, tell us about what Muhammad did, tell us about what Muhammad said, and tell us about how Islam began. The origins of Islam are all found in these four genres. And I'm going to add the Sahafa and the Tabi'un because Muslims make this claim all the time. I'm just going to take them at their word. All right? Any other questions you have?
Okay, not the question, but just also addition to what you said. So before complete manuscripts, we do have manuscripts after manuscripts. Like, for example, we've got manuscripts of Book of Revelation. We've got P9, 1 John. We've got P23, P20. We've got P72. We've got P46. Contains big chunks of Paul's letters.
These are the Chesterfield manuscripts, yeah.
Yeah, P75, P45, P52. So we've got lots of manuscripts before complete manuscripts, but they're not in complete form. They're just like part of chapter or part of book. The reason for that, as Jay expressed, because Christianity was under the persecution and we didn't have the money to do so anyway. So
what does P mean? What does P? Every time you say P, what does that mean?
Papyrus.
Papyrus, that's right. So make sure that they understand that. So any one of these are papyrus, and there's some of them. Also remember, we also have the Edict of Diocletian. Edict of Diocletian in 300 AD. That's before the Council of Nicaea, before Constantine, where thousands of Bibles were burned, destroyed by Diocletian himself, and that's why most of what did exist was destroyed in the 4th century. Those we cannot reproduce because they've been destroyed by fire. But however, a lot of them were also thrown into pits of trash. No, especially the biggest one is in Oxyrhynchus, where many of these peas come from. And Oxyrhynchus just in Egypt, and that's why an awful lot of them come from that trash pit.
Yeah, I just put it on the screen. This is just for the New Testament, by the way. I just put them on the screen for people to see, so it will be easier for them to compare. Like before Muhammad, how many manuscripts we have, what are they all together. So it is helpful for people to see it and then be confident on the reliability as well as trustworthy of the Bible.
And to be fair, Hatun, we're only talking about the New Testament because we're talking about the same parallels. The New Testament is our traditions. That is the tafsir, the hadith, the sirah, and the tahriq. Those are the four things that we have in the New Testament. It's the same as what we're talking about for the tafsir, the sirah, and the hadith of Muhammad.
Yeah, so when we say New Testament, we are talking about the four biography of Jesus, church history, Paul's letters to the churches, and then apostles' letters, and then book of Revelation.
And the sayings of Jesus in the hadith. Yeah. The hadith of Jesus, the sirah of Jesus, the tafsir of Jesus, and the tahriq of Jesus. Okay, that's why we're saying we're comparing like with like, and that's important that you put up that graph to show that we have so much more that we have preserved. All we're asking Muslims is to preserve one of them from the time period they've been telling us.
Okay, just people need to remember 7th century, Muslims have no to zero excuse to not have any complete manuscripts. They've got the money, they've got the power, and they've got the brain to put them together.
And they've got the environment. They're not under persecution. They are the ones that are persecuting the others. And there's no floods happening, there's no wars happening that any of these would have been destroyed. So where are they? And we've asked the same question about the Quran, haven't we? We've asked, why is it there's no original manuscript of the Quran in the 7th century? Where's Uthman's 5 codices that he left in Medina, and one sent to Mecca, one sent to Basra, one sent to Kufa in Iraq, and one sent to Damascus? Where are those 5 from the 7th century? That's only 1,400 years ago, all written on parchment. So we've already asked this many times of the Quran. Now we're asking about Muhammad's traditions, that which gives us and shows us who Muhammad was and what he did and what he said. So, who really wrote the Sīrah of Muhammad? That book that you see on the right there, The Life of Muhammad, translated by Alfred Guillaume, written, as he says, from Ibn Ishaq, until you open up the contents. And when you read the contents, you will find that it was not from Ibn Ishaq, it is from Ibn Hisham. Very clear that's Ibn Hisham. Now, I've read this book, you've read this book, we've all read this book. This is the book everybody has. This is the canon of his life. However, what people don't know is that there have been 36 different biographies written down in the last few hundred years. Most of them before this one. Okay. So where does this one come from?
Okay. Remember, I am woman, I've got half brain, I just help me. So, you said this book, even though it says it's a translation of Ibn Ishaq, it is actually Ibn Hisham. What is the relationship between Ibn Hisham and Ibn Ishaq?
Okay, exactly. Ibn Ishaq had 2 students, Baida, who is the one that actually the student that gave much of what Ibn Ishaq did. So therefore, he's a 2nd generation after Ibn Ishaq, and he's writing in the 9th century. Ibn Ishaq died in the mid-8th century, so about 70 years earlier. So he never knew Ibn Ishaq. But what's interesting is Ibn Hisham says, according to Guillaume, according to this book, if you read the introduction, that Ibn Hisham did not like much of what he heard, so he only kept what he liked and threw out the rest and put his own story together.
Yeah, all right. Experiences like that were lots of disturbing things. He didn't put them intentionally.
So he censored what he didn't like and kept what he liked. So he had an agenda, and I would say this is the Abbasid agenda. The Abbasids were notorious for this. We know that Al-Bukhari was given 600 of these stories, these sayings. And he whittled it down to 7,397 from 600,000. He threw out 98% of it. This was wholesale censorship. So that we know that. That's something that's well known. I don't think anybody listening has not heard this before.
Okay. So you are saying Ibn Hisham had no one-to-one connection with Ibn Ishaq. Did I understand that correctly?
Didn't know him. He was living 70 years after him.
Okay.
He was another generation after him, so he would not have known him, and that's why. But to me, that's superfluous.
He didn't study under him.
No.
Okay.
Probably never met him. It was his students that Ibn Hisham got it from. All right.
Okay. Do
So,
we have Ibn Hisham's origins?
nope, we don't. Not
don't.
one page, not one word, not one sentence. So where do we get it from? That man that you see right there on the screen. His name is Heinrich Ferdinand Wüstenfeld. He lived from 1808 to 1899, but between 1858 and 1860, he went to 4 different cities in Germany, and he went to the different libraries in those cities, and he pulled out as much as he could from those manuscripts, and I'll show you some other manuscripts he used, and he compiled it within that 2-year period and published it in 1860 in German, which was then translated by Guillaume into French, into English, and other languages. That's why we have it today. So everything we're reading about Muhammad, the canonical text of Muhammad, comes from that man right there.
Okay, so this man, I'm not even gonna try to pronounce his name. I can't even pronounce my own name most of the times. This Mr. German, so he visited 4 German city and then collects writings from them. So what is those writings? What he takes from? What are their dates? Who wrote them?
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Next slide. So here you go. I put Ibn Hisham there in green, but I've also put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 documents in yellow. Do you see them? Those are the documents he used to put together his book in 1860. So the first one he used was none of these are complete. None of them have really been studied. So he took a little bit from the document of Fez, which is written in 1063. He took some from the Or 6475, which is in the British Library today. You can go see it, written in 1278. He took more from what they call the manuscript of Arab in the Bodleian Library there in Oxford. He took others from the Chesty Beatty Library in Ireland. He took some more from the BNF Paris Bibliothèque Nationale there in Paris, and that was 1420. And then he also added to that some another manuscript which is sitting in the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London in 1589. So look at the dates: 1063, 1278, 1332, 1331, 1420, and 1589. Those are all from European libraries. 3 of them are right here in Britain. 1 is in France, and the other one is in Morocco. Now, none of them are complete. None of them are complete.
Okay, in 1900s, those manuscripts were in Germany, correct?
Well, those are copies that he got. He didn't get the originals. Those are copies that he found in Germany, because he didn't leave Germany. He just went to different cities in Germany and took those from those. Those are the only ones that exist. Those are the only ones that are available that anybody can use. And here's what's interesting. You may not like Wüstenfeld. You may not like what he did. You may say, well, that's too bad. We don't trust it. Then why don't people go back and study each one of those 6 manuscripts and see how much they differ from what Wüstenfeld finally ended up with?
So what is in the in Fez, which says like partial story? So what do we have? Which part of a current Ibn Hisham is that?
Exactly. Nothing.
Okay, so even though he used that, let's say, book to put together the current biography of Muhammad, so he used nothing from Fez?
Well, look at the date.
No, okay, I see the date. It's like 11th century.
11th century.
Okay, my question is, which stories are in Fez?
We don't know, because no one has done this study. We're the first to introduce this. See, notice. You're going to say, hold on a minute. Why is it since 1860 no one has bothered to go back and look at every one of these documents and compare whether or not they even agree? Wouldn't that be simple to do, since they're all in European libraries and one's in Morocco?
Are those 6 manuscripts, I'll call them manuscripts, 5 of them, 6 of them. So are they, any of them are exactly the same with one another?
Exactly. I have no idea, since no one's done any study on them. Since then, the last 160 years, no one's asked the question you're asking.
Okay. And Mr. German didn't put in his writings, he took this part from this book, he took this part from this book. He didn't do that.
Why would he? He wanted to make a lot of money.
Well, in 1800s, I'm not sure if you could make that much
No
money.
one was asking this question. All they needed is to get a whole story about this man Muhammad so the Muslims could read who this man was.
So why was in 1800s it was his like why did he want to do that in 1800s?
Mainly because no one had done it yet. Look how much money he's made. And then, of course, Guillaume has made a mint on that because look at those. That's what has been sold all over the world. Now, once you get the story, then you can sell it.
Okay, so you are saying his main reason to just like look at those books are just for financial reasons.
I would say for the financial and also for his legacy. He wanted to leave a legacy. I don't know. I never asked him. He's not around. I'd love to be able to ask him. But what I think is more important, if Muslims don't like this, then why haven't Muslims gone to those libraries? Why haven't they long? And why haven't seen? Why hasn't anybody compared any of those 6? 4 of them are right here. 5 of them are here in Europe. 4 of them are here in Britain and Ireland. One's in France and the other one's in Morocco. They're not far to get. So why hasn't anybody done this? So what I'm saying is we need a few doctorates done right now. And I hope somebody listening will do this as a doctoral study. Let's see how accurate Wustenfeld is. But isn't it interesting that nothing begins to appear until the 11th century. And the other ones don't begin to appear until the 13th and 14th and the 16th century of what then is put together in the 19th century.
Okay, so what is your source that he used these 6 manuscripts? Does he say that in his book?
We're going to be public. We're going to be putting that out so everybody can see it. That has our researchers do that. They are the ones that are going to actually look and actually have every one of these stipulated so you can see exactly where they are. And at that point, we have to have somebody then go to the one in Fez. We have someone to have to go to the SOAS library, the one in the Bodleian library, also the one in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and also to the one in SOAS, and start comparing them because all of them are partial. None of them are complete. But what's interesting, none of them predate the 11th century. And most of them are from the 13th, 14th, and the 16th century. This is during the Ottoman period. So what was happening in the Ottoman period that all these manuscripts were written? And why is it that Muslims have not looked at this before? Why have Muslims not done this work? Why is it that they still don't own these manuscripts and they still don't control them or they still aren't researching them? And why is it they're all depending on Wustenfeld for everything they know about Muhammad? Why hasn't this question that you're asking been asked hundreds of years ago, 160 years ago? Okay?
Okay,
so that's
you are aware that like no one needs to kind of turn up those libraries because lots of those things probably can be seen online.
They're probably all online. And I'm sitting there pulling my hair out and says, why is it that we're the first to put this in public in fear? Why are we the first one to even introduce this?
Okay.
Mainly because we've been spending all our time on the Quran. We haven't really looked at the traditions yet. So this is the beginning. You're the first to hear it, Hatun. And what you did 3 weeks ago is the first time this has ever been put up there to show the dates for everything that Muslims have assumed is sacrosanct. We always assume that the biography of Muhammad was written by Ibn Hisham when none of it comes from Ibn Hisham. Look at his dates. He's way back in the 9th century. Nothing comes from the 9th century. We don't even know if he wrote one word of these. Okay, let's go to the Hadith now. Now we come to the sayings. We've been told that they are all from the 9th century. But are they? Go ahead. Let's look at a timeline. Now, this is before we get to the time. Now, here are the dates that we now know. These are the dates of all the earliest manuscripts for every one of these. The Hadith of Ibn Dawud is not from the 9th century. It was written in the 11th century. That's 200 years after Ibn Dawud supposedly wrote it. An-Nasai was written in the 12th century. That's 300 years after he supposedly wrote it. Ibn Majah was written in the 13th century. That's 400 years after he supposedly wrote it. Jami' al-Tirmidhi is from the 14th century. That's 500 years after he wrote it. Now look at the last two, the two most important, the two that are Sahih, that are sacrosanct, the two that are not to be questioned. Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari are from the 14th and 15th century. That is 500 to 600 years after they were supposed to have written. The two most important ones. Notice those dates: 12th, 13th, 14th, 14th, and 15th. That is all Ottoman period. These are all written in the Ottoman period. Now, before we go to the timeline, I also want to show you the Sahaba and the Tabi'un of Muhammad. These are the ones that some Muslims, not all Muslims, but many Muslims, the majority of Muslims that I talk to and I engage with, they say the Sahaba were there, the Tabi'un, those who were right with Muhammad. They were right there. They were the ones that were the eyewitnesses. They are the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or they are the Matthew and John that we have for the New Testament. The Sahaba are those. And they refer to the Muwatta ibn Malik, that he was there in the 7th century. No, he was not. He was writing, his manuscript comes from the 9th century, 200 years after the fact. They talk about the Sahifa of Ahmad ibn Munabi. That is not from the 7th century. That is the 12th century. The Musnad of Ibn Hanbal is not from the 7th century. It's from the 13th century. That's 600 years later. The Musnad of Abdul Razak is not from the 7th century. It's from the 13th century, like the one before. Same with the Musnad al-Tayalisi. It is from the 13th century. All of them are 600 years later, including Abi Shaiba. None of these are from the 7th century. They're not even from the 9th century. They're from the 12th, 13th century. That is 200 to 600 years later. These documents were all supposedly created in the 7th to 9th century, yet they do not begin to appear until the 9th to the 15th century, thus from 200 to 600 years too late. This suggests that they are all written by others hundreds of years later. Consequently, they are all nothing more than redacted attributions. You know what that means? A redacted attribution?
Yeah, someone wrote it, but and that it has been written much earlier.
Yeah. So you want to get authority, you write up someone who is well known. So you put his name to it. You put Dawud names. You put Nasai. You put Maja. You put Tirmidhi. You put Muslim. You put Bukhari. And that's why all of these are nothing more than attributions. We don't have any original manuscripts for any of them. Now let's look at a timeline. Let's put them on a timeline so you get the visual. You get the visual support for what we're saying. Okay. Now look at. I have the 5 of them right there. This is the hadith. I have the 6 major hadith right there. Right there. You see that?
Yeah, yellow ones.
No, the blue ones. The blue ones. That's what every Muslim tells us are when they were written. This is what everybody has known. This is what I've been saying for years, 200 to 300 years later. None of them are from the 9th and 10th century. They're all the yellow ones. You need to look at the yellow ones. Dawud is 11th century. Nasai is 12th century. Ibn Majah, 13th century. Tirmidhi, 13th century. Sahih Muslim, 13th century. And Bukhari, the most important, the one that everybody goes to, that is Sahih. It is by far the most authoritative one. It's how we know how the Quran was put together was because of Ibn Bukhari. That is not till the 14th and 15th century.
That's the date of their manuscripts that we have.
The earliest manuscript that exist today. Those are the earliest dates.
Okay, so Abu Dawud, you say it's 11th century. That's like how many? Three centuries too late from what is what is.
No, it's 2 centuries too late. 200 years too late.
899, 11. Okay, 2 century. So the manuscripts. How much of that manuscripts has what we have Abu Dawud?
Exactly, we don't know because no one's done any study on it.
What about Sahih Bukhari?
Same with Sahih Bukhari. No one has done what you're asking. We just know when the earliest manuscripts. Now, I'm assuming that all 9 volumes are in the 15th century. I'm hoping that they're there, but I could well be wrong. I could do the same. I could well be in the same problem that Wustenfeld was, and that is there was no complete manuscript. Okay. He was the one that put it together in the 19th century, so there would be a complete manuscript.
If sake of the argument, if it is all there on 14th and 15th century, then there is a question of why it has been officialized or canonized in 1800s.
It wasn't. Bukhari wasn't the 1800s. That's the Sīrah you're getting mixed up with.
No. Bukhari was canonized in 1313 after Hijrah, 1300 after Hijrah. Current Bukhari, which we are reading, that is canonization.
Okay, then what we need to do is where did they get what manuscript? This is the earliest manuscript that exists. Where are there subsequent ones? We haven't even had a chance to do it. We have so much yet to do. This is the earliest that we can find. There are probably others that come subsequent to the 14th and 15th that may be in the 17th and the 18th that were then finally canonized in the 18th. But that we've had no chance. We've not had the time to do it yet.
Are those manuscripts held by West or they are in Muslim countries?
Some of them are in Turkey, in your country. A lot of them are in Turkey. Other ones that we have found, the only ones that we can find are the ones that we see there. And that we're all going to publish that. That's all going to come up so you can see exactly where they're all housed. I just didn't have time or the space to put them up here.
Okay.
Okay.
Lots to come. Lots to come.
So 400 to 800 years. I mean, every one of those yellow marks that you see there could be a doctoral research. Every one of those. And what I'm asking is, why in the world have Muslims not done this? They've all been sitting on the 9th century and 10th century thinking that's all they need to do without ever supporting any of those from any extant manuscripts from the 9th and 10th century. All of them come from 200 to 400 to 800 years later.
I just wanted to bring something to people's attention. So I think also it is not the main concern is not they are too late. But the concern is, even though they are too late, the informations within them are not trustworthy. For example, Mecca, that wasn't exist in 7th century. So someone intentionally kind of decided to put those false informations together pretty much later. What was the agenda can be another practical question.
Okay, now you're starting to answer the question you asked at the very beginning. Why did it take so long to actually get the Hadith written down, to get the Sīrah written down? The reason why is that you had many disputes that were going on within Islam that had to be ameliorated. So what do? In order to put your agenda forward, in order to put your argument forward, you then have to destroy what had come earlier that contradicts yours and make sure that yours is the one that Muhammad said. Yours is the one that Muhammad did. As long as Muhammad's name and as long as Muhammad's authority is attributed to your writing, then your writing becomes the canonical text. So a lot of these are disputes that are happening during the Ottoman period in places like Turkey, your country, that were then finally finalized, and everything that comes before it was probably put to the fire.
So you are telling me not only they burn their Quran, but also they burn their Hadith?
Well, why would we be surprised with that? Okay, that's the Hadith. Let's go to the next one. Now we get to the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. And maybe we should have started with this because this is what Muslims claim are the earliest. These are the ones that predate the Hadith, predate the Sīrah, predate the Tafsir, and predate the Tahrir. So let's go ahead and let's ask what they say, what they claim. The Sahaba are the first generation. They were the ones that were the companions. The Tabi'un would be the second generation. They come after the Sahaba. Let's look at their dates. Notice, everybody says in the blue, they always claim that they're right there in the 7th century with Muhammad. That's what most Muslims claim. Now, they're not every Muslim. There are a few that don't claim that. But notice when you actually put the dates to their dates, they're the black ones there. See the black ones? That's 747, 796, 820, 827, 849, and 855. That's why I put those there in black, because that really, none of them knew Muhammad at all. They were not there. They were not Sahabas. They're not even Tabi'un. These are not even the same century. 747 is the earliest. 855 is the latest of those six that many people claim. I hear Muslims always saying these are the Sahaba, these are the companions of the Prophet. None of them were companions, not if they died in 747 or died in 855. So I wanted to put those in black. However, let's see when any one of their let's now look at their earliest manuscripts for any one of them. And the earliest one we have is the Muwatta of Ibn Malik, which is the 9th century. That's the very earliest we have. That is 200 years after what he's attributed for. Then we have the Salafah of Haman bin Munabi. That's the 12th century. And then we have the Musnad of Ibn Hanbal. That is the 13th century, along with the Musnad of Abdul Razak. That's the 13th century, along with the Musnad of Al-Tayalisi. That's 13th century. And of course, Abi Shaiba, that's 13. These are all Ottoman, except for the first two, they're all Ottoman documents, which are all attributed to the Sahaba, of possibly men that did exist, but they never wrote those. Not one of them wrote those manuscripts. They may have written the Munabi, they may have written the Muwatta, but none of their manuscripts exist. They have all been destroyed and replaced with these ones. And that's why these ones are the ones that are now canonical today. What we need to ask is, why in the world were the early ones destroyed? And I would suggest that the earlier ones were destroyed because most of them were Umayyad documents. And as we know, the Abbasids destroyed any of the things that the Umayyads had. So these are mostly Abbasid documents and, of course, Ottoman documents. And again, why do they do this? Because they have to have something that is claimed to have come from the Prophet himself, that is claimed to something that he did or something that he said. Therefore, you give the reference of a person that was a companion, and you give the reference of someone who's a tabi'un to give authority to what you're writing, so that your viewpoint or your discussion or the type of theology you're trying to introduce or the practice that you're trying to introduce is given credibility. Nonetheless, they are not giving names of people that actually knew Muhammad or actually were living with Muhammad, because every one of the names that they were giving came, if they did live, they came from the 8th and 9th and up until the 8th and 9th up until the 9th century. All their writings don't come until hundreds of years later. In this case, 200 to 600 years later.
Okay. I just want to draw attention to the phrase you are using, destroyed. It is like you are not saying, oh, they didn't survive. You are saying they were destroyed. The reason I think that term is that the reason, because it was capable to survive the material they used, but destroyed because there were people who were not happy with it. And we know from the Islamic tradition, it was very common practice for Muslims to destroy their own materials.
Yeah, I mean, you say that with a smile, but that's exactly the truth. That is exactly the problem. So that's why I'm not disputing that these people did exist. I'm not disputing that. By the 8th and 9th century, Islam was already starting to be formed. So that is not in dispute. What I'm disputing is what they are purported to have written is not from them.
Okay.
Okay. Let's go to the next one, and that's now the tafsir and the tahqiq of supposedly Al-Tabari. See, Al-Tabari is the one that supposedly is the one that gives us the tahqiq, the history, and the tafsir, the commentaries that to unpack it. That's why he's so important, because he gives us so much of what is contradictory that doesn't agree with each other. It suggests to me that this was nothing more than many different disputes happening with many different people, and all put on to the shoulders of Al-Tabari. That's what I've always assumed for years and years and years. Boy, was I wrong. So now let's go to the next timeline. Here we go. So let's now put Al-Tabari's extant tahqiq compilations onto a similar timeline. Notice, Tabari is in brown there. He died within 300 years of Muhammad's death. That's bad enough. We always thought that was bad enough. But where do we get Al-Tabari from? Well, we get it from a Dutch scholar. Remember, the other one was a German scholar. Is a Dutch scholar named Michael Jan de Rugge. I don't know how to pronounce, but I've been told it's Rugge. The professor of Arabic at Leiden University in the Netherlands, who between 1879 and 1901 wrote what we know as the Leiden edition. That's the earliest Al-Tabari manuscript we have. Yet de Rugge used two 13th century Arabic manuscripts, which are in Turkey today. They're still there today as his model. So he had to go back to Turkey to the 13th century to find out anything that Tabari said. 13th century is Ottoman. That's why they're in Turkey. So even Al-Tabari's tahqiq and his tafsir are not 10th century originals, but are much later 13th century compilations, which were merely attributed back to Al-Tabari 300 years later to give authority to them, yet they are still 600 years too late. What's more, it took a Dutch scholar, not a Muslim scholar, to compile them 1,200 years later. So to me, I'm just saying, why haven't we heard this before? We have been assuming that all of this came from people from the 9th and 10th century. None of it comes from anybody from the 9th and 10th century. There may have been someone named Al-Tabari in the 10th century. I'm not disputing that. I have no difficulty with that. What I'm saying is what we read that he's written had nothing to do with him. It was written 400 years, 300 years later, 400 years later, and attributed. These are nothing more than redactions.
So 1453 is the when Istanbul is being conquered, and your dates for manuscripts is 1244 in Istanbul. Is like, should I think that as Byzantines were holding the manuscripts, or once kind of Turks took Istanbul, they kind of brought the manuscripts there.
They brought them with them. Now, that's why De Goehe got in 1877, 1901, he had to go to Turkey. He had to go to Istanbul to read them.
Okay. So what do we have? So Tabari is like, I think it's 40 volume. Is these two books altogether 40 volumes, or they are like doubled of these 40 volumes? What is
exactly? Even I can't answer it. Nobody has bothered to go back and research them. There's another doctor to be done. All I'm doing tonight is showing you the dates. I'm not telling you what they include. I'm not saying what Jan de Goehe. I'd like to know how much of that Jan de Goehe threw out and what he retained. I'd like to know that question. Why hasn't anybody done this before? Why is it we've now been waiting over 100 years and no one's bothered to do it? So you're looking at a lot of research that's yet to be done. All I'm doing tonight is showing you the dates for the extant manuscripts. That's all I'm interested in. And isn't that interesting, Hatun, that no one has done this publicly until we've done this? Why is it we're the first to introduce this to the whole world? I'm sure in scholarly circles they know well this. I mean, in German circles, Dr. Robert Kerr knows all about this. He's aware of this. I said, well, why haven't you published it? He said, there is not a desire to publish this because of the reaction Muslims will give. There is a fear of publishing this because we would just like Muslims to believe that these are all early without realizing you're not doing them a favor. Didn't do us a favor if we had sat on our documents and then didn't know what the dates were. Thank God for people like Wellhausen and the school in Tübingen that demanded that we find dates for them, that demanded we find extant manuscripts, that demanded that we could find the historicity for Jesus Christ. That's why we are so clear of who Jesus is and what he did and what he said, because we were forced to do that in the 1800s. So why has it not been done before 2024? Why have none of us even asked these questions like you're asking tonight? Because this is the first you're sharing it. You've never seen this before, have you?
I haven't bothered to look at Tabari. My focus is other things. So there are two books or manuscripts in Istanbul. Has part of Tabari, all of the Tabari. We don't know what it is. And someone in late 1900s decides to translate them or compile them.
Compile them so that they make sense. But as a result, you can see even he didn't know what to do, so he just put them together as the best he could, and that's why there's so many contradictions.
Okay, I was just curious that you put there today was compiled by Michael blah blah.
And look how much time it took him to do that. I mean,
okay.
that took him over 20 years to do that.
Yeah. Okay.
22 years it took him to do that.
Well, it's 40 volumes we have, so quite a lot of work.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now I want to be careful. I'm not triflistic tonight. Don't think that this is a great thing that Muslims have been, why is it heinous? We've done the same thing in Christianity. We have also very similar. The Gnostic Gospels, 52 found in the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, written in Coptic, purporting to tell stories of Jesus' childhood. Yet they were all written in the 4th century, redacted back to the 1st century, and supposedly were written by those who knew Jesus and saw what he did and heard what he said. None of them were written by people that knew Jesus or saw what he did. So we're well aware that this is the same thing exists in Christianity. For instance, look at the Gospel of Thomas, probably the most famous, a Muslim favorite, where you have Jesus as a child killing people who disagree with him. Now, maybe Jesus did kill people. Well, if we want to go with the Gospel of Thomas, then we have to see this guy was a murderous, killed child. The Gospel of Judas is another one that people love. These were written in the 2nd century, but are attributed by authors to have been the disciple of Jesus Christ himself. So this is called an attribution. You redact it back and you put the name on it so that it is given authority as being someone who was right there, like a Sahaba of Jesus, a companion of Jesus. Probably the most famous one is the Gospel. Go ahead.
Let me ask a clarification question. So, for example, Gospel of Thomas, the reason it is not part of the scripture and it is not reliable because...
Okay, you're jumping ahead now. You're jumping ahead. Well, I'm going to get to that, all right? Hold on to that. Don't say anything more, all right? Let me give you the other example. Probably the most famous one is the Gospel of Barnabas. That's the one the Muslims love the best, because here is this gospel supposedly written by the companion of Paul, who was there in the first century. He was there where Jesus lived. He knew Jesus probably intimately, and yet he wrote this, that Jesus had become a Muslim. And he had all kinds. The guy was really, you can see whoever wrote it, had never been to Israel. He'd never been to Jerusalem, and he certainly hadn't been to Capernaum, because he put Capernaum way up in the mountains and Nazareth on the Sea of Galilee. So obviously he didn't know his geography. There are so many errors in it, but Muslims love it because Jesus is a Muslim in that gospel. It wasn't until they did some forensic study on the earliest manuscript, and they found that it was written in 1634. It's a 7th century manuscript written by a Spanish monk who had converted to Islam in Spain, redacted back to Barnabas, and has become a favorite of all the Muslims today. So that's why Muslims love the Gospel of Barnabas. But here, all of these were written in order to give credibility and authority for those works. This monk didn't put his name to it, because who would believe him if he's writing in 1634? So he put Barnabas's name, call it the Gospel of Barnabas, so that everybody would therefore accept it, and he would be a celebrity. And the Muslims have been duped. They fell right into the trap. And Muslims are aware of this. They've always looked for anything that's late that fits their narrative. So this practice is also very common in every religion. Now, here's the difference, and this is what you're going to get at. The difference is that while the later Muslim traditions are all considered authoritative, look at all these traditions that are 2 to 3 to 6 to 1,200 years later, that's the ones that Muslims consider to be the most authoritative. The later Christian traditions are all considered to be fraudulent because they are late. And they are never used by the church today because they're all too late. You never, listen, whenever there's an accident on a street, 2 cars collide, what do the police do? They put a sign there, and they put the time and they put the date, and then they put a phone number. And they say, if anybody is here who actually saw the accident, call this number. They don't want to hear what a neighbor heard or what came a day later or 2 days. They wanted someone who was actually at the event to actually tell them what actually happened. That's what you do. You go to the person who was there. You don't go to someone who wrote this 2 to 4 to 6 to 1,200 years later and redacted back on to somebody who supposedly knew the prophet or got it from the prophet. You go to the person that's right there. And yet everything we're finding about everything that Muhammad said, everything that Muhammad did, everything that what he did is how it's understood, and also the history of early Islam, all of that is from 2 to 1,200 years later. None of it is from the time period of Muhammad himself. Now, that's why we don't do that as Christians, but Muslims have made a whole practice of doing that. Our authoritative gospel accounts are the ones we go to because they're the earliest. They were there by people writing at that time and in that place. So let's go to the next slide to see exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay, before you move to the next slide, you talked about Gospel of Thomas, and you told about you said this is where Jesus is killing. I think you are talking about the infancy Gospel of Thomas. There is which is written late 2nd century, where there is a story as a child, Jesus is killing a boy and then also striking another boy. So that's like infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is written late 2nd century, and that cannot be from the disciple of Jesus. Too late for us to even think that might be any reliable story at all.
There you go. All right. Now, I want to now demand the same thing of Christianity. I want us to say that, let's see, we have to ask the same thing of ourselves. We also have the exact same genre. We have the Sīrah of Jesus. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which is the black letter part of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have the Hadith of Jesus, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What Jesus said in many Bibles, it's written in letter. I've got a Bible right down here. It's all in red, what he said. That's the Hadith of Jesus. We also have the Tafsir, as I said earlier. That's Paul's letters that were writing about what Jesus said. He applied to Ephesus, to Philippi, to Corinth, to Rome, to many churches that he started. He wrote letters to them to understand and unpack what Jesus said so that it could be lived out in their daily lives. That's called the tafsir of Jesus. And then we have the tahqiq, which would be Luke himself, who wrote the story, the history of the early church. So we have the exact same four genres of what we've just gone through with Muhammad. So when you look at Jesus and you look at the dates, now I'm using the most liberal dates I can find, Hatun, all right? I'm not using dates that I necessarily agree with, but this is the most liberal great dates to make my point. If Jesus died in 33 AD, according to Tacitus and according to the historians, nobody really disputes that today. 33 AD is when he died. The first genre of these four that start to appear is the Tahqiq, the book of Acts, written by Luke. And he wrote it between 52 and 62 AD. When he died in 62 AD, that's within 20 to 30 years after Jesus died, you have the history of the early church. Then you have Paul, who was executed in Rome in 65 AD. But he started writing within 15 years of Christ's death. So from 15 to 34 years, between 48 AD and 65 AD, the tafsir, all his letters are written. That means by 65, within 30 years of Christ's death, all his are finished. Then the the Sīrah and the Hadith of Jesus start to appear. The first is Mark. Not everybody's going to agree with me on that. That's okay. But let's say he died in 70 AD, like most historians believe. His his Sīrah and his Hadith would be within 37 years of Christ's death. Then you get Matthew and Luke, who die in 80 AD. Their Sīrah and their Hadith are written within 47 years of Christ's death. And the last would be John, who is living in Ephesus, and he died a normal life. He died normally, like most people. The others were all killed. But he at least survived up until 90 AD, living in Ephesus. So his Sīrah and his Hadith were written within 57 years of Christ's death. Notice, all of these Tahqiq, Tafsir, Sīrah, and Hadith of Jesus were written within 29 to 57 years of Christ's death. What's most important, every one of those names that you see there, all of these New Testament writers lived in the same place Jesus lived. They didn't live hundreds of miles away. And they either knew him personally, like John and Matthew, or they got the material from others who did know him personally, who were eyewitnesses to what he said and what he did. There's the difference. That's why we go to them, because they are so close to the event. They are not only close, they were there. They saw him. They lived amongst him. John and Matthew, they were there with him for 3 years, listening to what he said and seeing what he did. So that's why we can trust them. All right, now let's go to the next slide. Now I'm going to put it all together here.
Okay, just let me pause here. We've been at Speaker's Corner for a long time, and then we had conversations with Muslims for a long time. Why are you not using the same criteria that you used for Islamic tradition for the New Testament? So, for example, Book of Acts, you are saying, okay, this is the early church history dated approximately 20 to 30 years after the death of Jesus. When we look at the history, what we get to see is for earliest manuscripts of Book of Acts. Earliest manuscripts of Book of Acts is just a parchment dated 2nd or 3rd century.
Yep.
So that's too late. What about, for example, Paul's letters? You are saying, okay, this is the kind of letters to the churches. For example, we've got P46 dated 200 AD. That's like 160 years after death of Jesus. And our earliest manuscripts, like under the P46, is Romans 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Hebrews, and 1 Thessalonians. Yep. So that's like too late. And like we can kind of have the same late numbers with Islam. But
okay, here we go. Are you ready? I'll answer that real quickly. I've already said one half of my answer, and that is because the earliest manuscripts were written on papyrus, therefore they would not last more than 100 years. That's why all these P's that you're talking about are papyrus, this papyrus, that papyrus. They're just fragments. Fragments upon fragments upon fragments. But we don't just have manuscript evidence. And really, the manuscripts that really are extant that we can still look at that are complete are not till the 4th century. That's the Sinaiticus.
The point I'm trying to make is So manuscripts are survived. The ones are survived are for the dates they are later. And for example, like Mark doesn't say, oh, I am Mark, I am writing the biography of Jesus. Matthew doesn't say, hi guys, I am Matthew, I am the one who was the tax collector who wrote the biography of Jesus. So it is the like same thing when it comes to the Islamic tradition.
Okay, are you ready? Here we go.
That's what Muslim is going to tell you.
Exactly, and I have no problem with that. Of course they're going to come back. That's why I'm not just dependent on the manuscripts. We have to go beyond the manuscripts. We have other material. We have lectionaries, for instance. Lectionaries, which are written as liturgy in church, where you would repeat exactly the verses that are taken out of scripture and put into a book, so that Christians on Sunday morning would then repeat the scripture depending on the theme of that, whatever that sermon was that day. So those have been preserved. Those are a completely different genre than the manuscript. We have 2,135 of them that exist by the 6th century that we can look at. Every one of them exactly parallels what we have in the manuscript edition. But most importantly, probably the most exciting part, even the manuscript evidence that we do have, take a look at the translations. We have Coptic translations. We have Ethiopic translations. We have 19,000 manuscripts in 11 different languages, starting from the 2nd to the 3rd to 4th, that continue right up until the 4th century. All of these 19,000 translations in 11 different languages, they have all been read. They have all been compared. They all say the same thing. If we had wanted to corrupt one word or a sentence, if we had wanted to change it, we would have to go to every one of those 19,000 manuscripts in 11 different languages, change every one of them so they so they would agree with each other. Now, what's fascinating, those languages are in many different countries that are under many different authorities. There was no caliph that we have in Christianity. We didn't have a pope like we have today back then. And that's why all of these different churches could have changed it, manipulated, deleted it. The fact that they all agree, all 11 languages, all agree with the Greek manuscripts. The Greek manuscripts, as you said right there, 8,000 Greek manuscripts. What's the latest number?
5,856.
Sorry, 5,800 Greek manuscripts. We have another 10,000 Latin Vulgates, 2 completely different languages, the largest number of manuscripts to look up. And another 19,000 from 11 different languages. We're talking about 24,000 manuscripts. 24,000 manuscripts alone. If we had tried to manipulate them or change them, that would have showed up in any one of those manuscripts or any one of those languages. But probably the best genre that we can go to is what we call the early church fathers quotations. The early church fathers, from the very beginning, when the Gnostics were coming into the church, they were disputing who Jesus was. They were disputing about his divinity, about the Trinity. They were just making all kinds of disputes. The early church fathers had to write letters to defend what they meant, what they believed, what the church believed. Now, rather than sit there and debate like you and I do at Speaker's Corner, rather than do that, they did a much more clever thing. They didn't care about what they said. They didn't care about their opinion. They wanted that Scripture would give the Scripture would be what they use. So people like you're putting there, Clement of Rome, or Polycarp, or Tertullian, or Pliny the Younger, they would write reference after reference straight out of the Scriptures, and they would put it there as their defense. Now, those early church fathers' writings have amalgamated, and they have increased and increased, so that they are available today. Many of them were found in Oxyrhynchus, in the trash pits there. Many of them have been collected. And there have been about 85,000 of them, primarily by people like Dr. Jean Burgon and Dr. David Dalrymple, who have spent their careers amalgamating and bringing and collecting all these 85,000 church writers' quotations. But what they wanted to find is how many of these quotations predated the manuscript evidence. So predated the 4th century, predated the Sinaiticus, the Alexandrinus, and the Vaticanus. That's hugely important. So they wanted to just choose those early church fathers' quotations that came before 300 AD. By commanding and putting them together, they wanted to see how much of the New Testament they included. And they included every book of the New Testament, not completely. But the one book that they found was included the most was the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John was the most important gospel because has the highest Christology. It's the one that really solidifies the divinity of Jesus Christ. So they wanted to look at these Oh, it's 86,000. I was off by 1,000. So it's 86,489. Now they wanted to go back to these 30. You have 36 per 300. So it's 30. See, I'm off by 2,000 there. So you got even more than what I have. 36,000 that predated the 4th century, predated the Council of Nicaea, predated these metropolitan codices that we've been talking about.
Yeah, let me just make a point. So even though biblical manuscripts, survived biblical manuscripts are not from the time that it is written down, we've got more than enough from first and second century quotations from the church fathers, from the translations, from the lecture notes, from the early church fathers. We've got more than enough to look into it and then say, what I am reading today in my hand is very much trustworthy. It doesn't it doesn't get the cities wrong. It doesn't get the peoples wrong. It doesn't kind of pretend, oh, it was once again upon a time. No, it tells me what was happening in that time. Therefore, I can trust it. Therefore, I can look at them and then I can say, oh yeah, this Gospel of Thomas cannot be from 1st century. Oh, this Infancy Gospel of Thomas cannot be from 1st century. They cannot be as reliable sources because the mistakes those documents contain.
Yeah. And that's why it's so good that we have, now we're talking about 3 different genres we're looking at. We're looking at the manuscript evidence, 24,000 of them, 19,000 of them, which are in 11 different languages. At some point, they should disagree if they were written by different authors or they've been accreted or deleted. They don't disagree whatsoever in all 11 languages. We've got the 2,135 lectionaries. We've got 86,000 early church fathers quotations. Say again?
More than enough.
And 36,000. But what I love is what they found about the Gospel of John. See, the Gospel of John is by far the most authoritative of all of our Gospels because of what it says about Jesus Christ. It was really confronting the Gnostic attacks against his divinity. That's why I love it, because Muslims are confronting our attacks. They're attacking the divinity of Jesus right, left, and center. That's why the Gospel of John is such an effective gospel for them. When they looked at these early church quotations that predated the 4th century, they were able to reproduce the entire Gospel of John from these early church fathers quotations, except for 11 verses. That's why I love the authority that we have today. And so you can throw out all the manuscripts. Please don't. We want to keep them. But you can throw them all out and still go back to the early church fathers quotations along with the lectionaries and still reproduce them. If not in Greek or in Latin, we can certainly reproduce them in another 11 different languages. That's the beauty that we have of the New Testament, our tafsir, our tahqiq, our hadith, and our sirah. So can you see why we're saying this? If we can reproduce this in so much detail and in such huge, massive amount of manuscript evidence, then why in the world can Muslims not say the same? Where are their early church fathers, the early imams quotations? Where are there any? Where are their lectionaries that Islam has? A different genre from the manuscript evidence. They just don't exist. We've already been asking this about the Quran, but if the Muslims can't even come up with one document at all from the time of Muhammad, from the same century as Muhammad, they can't even come up for the Quran when it comes to that. Oh, the Birmingham photos is all they can come up with, which is pre-Islamic, pre-Quranic, and pre-Muhammad. Those are all Arabic writings that were well known. They're pagan writings and they're Christian sectarian writings, and they're right out of our Bible. Of course, those predate Islam because they were well known right way back to the 1st century, 2nd century AD. Those were swinging around in Arabic. They cannot find even their first manuscript of the Quran. Now, can you see? We're asking an even more difficult question. Forget about just the Quran. What about these traditions surrounding Muhammad? What he said, what he did? None of these come from the 7th century. None of them come from the 8th century. They don't even come from the 9th century. They start to appear. The Muwatta is the earliest that we can find. That is from the 9th century. And then they go from the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, all the way up until the 18th century. Thank God I don't have to defend this. And I don't know how Muslims are going to defend this. Because we're the first to introduce this into the world. There's so much more research. All the questions you are asking tonight, Hatun, need to be answered. You're correct. These are great questions. You're picking it up. You're understanding that we've got to do this. Let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to have to leave because I realize now that I was supposed to have been done an hour ago. But what I want to do, let's just finish this material. We'll come back and do another one on the Muhammad, because the Muhammad goes right after this. What happened to the slide here? This one got compromised. Okay, so let's end off with the slide. Even though we'll just take off that red border. Go to that next slide that you have here. So when you compare Christianity with Islam, we can come up all of our documents about who Jesus was, what he did, what he said, all the tafsir and the tariq about how that's applied to the different churches and how the history of the early church was written within 15 to 60 years of his death. Everything that we have about Islam, about who Muhammad was, what he said, what he did, and how it's to be applied and how it was canonized comes from 200 to 1,200 years after. Which do you think is more authoritative? As a comparison, if we were dependent on sources for Jesus comparable to what Muslims are dependent on for Muhammad, Jesus would not begin to appear until the 3rd or 4th century. There would be no Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or Paul, or Peter, and any of the others living in the 1st century. They would all be from the 3rd and 4th century. They would not be living around Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Israel today. They would be all up in Turkey, hundreds of miles away and hundreds of years later. Thank God we don't have this problem. How would we defend him? And why haven't Muslims told us this before? Why haven't Muslims come clean on what exactly and who exactly their prophet is and what we know about him? Obviously, we know very little about their prophet. That goes and segues right into what I'm going to talk next, but we're going to have to save that for another time. We can do that next week or the week after. What about the name Muhammad himself? Is it found in the 7th century? Let's end this here, and I want you to come back to me on any questions, or are there any questions that people have who are listening?
Well, I've got lots of questions on the manuscripts, but I think we will have to pick them up in our next meeting, since I kept you. It's been like 2.5 hours, Jay. Very.
We started at 7:30. It's now 10 o'clock. Yeah, we've gone 2.5 hours.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I was up till 5 this morning teaching, so I'm knackered. I have to teach every Monday night, or here in London, it's to start at 1 o'clock in the morning, and I go to 5.
That's okay. You can survive. I trust you, Jane.
No, this is what you do. I don't do this. You're a master at this, and that's why I have so much admiration for your ability to do that.
Yeah, I've got questions on manuscript stuff, but and then hopefully people will have questions as well. I will put them together all once we meet again next time. We deal with those questions, and then hopefully by that time, like, you will put all those details on your website, and then we approach the Muslims and then ask those very basic questions to hang them on those things.
Okay. See, now this is the first time that you saw 3 weeks ago. I think at that time I went too fast. You're right. I think at that time also the PowerPoint didn't work, and I was frustrated because I wanted the animations. I've taken out the animations, and even still, that last slide, it was not paginated correctly. So there's still problems, I think, with.
It's okay. Not big deal.
When I do it on Zoom, it works perfectly, but it doesn't. Your live stream here, your what's it called? Yeah, it doesn't seem to like PowerPoints. It doesn't seem to like those.
I paid a lot of money for that StreamYard, Jay.
Well, if you did pay so much money, have them to improve their product. Their product is absolutely hopeless. Why is it Zoom does it so perfectly and StreamYard doesn't? Anyhow, we're here to talk about that. But I mean, to wrap this up, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Tell me what you think, and then I'll tell you what I think.
I've got lots of questions. I love to engage with Muslims and then ask them about things. My main questions would be on the life of Muhammad, reliability of that source, as well as Sahih Bukhari. There are lots of materials that needs to be dig into it more and then look into it. Anything kind of we sit down and then learn from you or from other brothers and sisters. It is a resource for us to use it to critique the ideology of Islam the way Lord calls you to do, internal critic, external critic, cultural critic. But the main point is supposed to be we critique ideology of Islam so that we cause them to have doubt. They go and check what we said. Be confident what we said. Check it out, check it out, check it out. And then when we come to the conclusion that what we told you is true, that means Islam is false religion. Yeah. And then we are there already by that stage. We already use this material to preach the glorious gospel of glorious God. So I look at those materials from that sense, and I'm just grateful. I've got more materials to engage with Muslims and then question the reliability of their faith.
Listen, it just seems like the more we scratch, the more we find. The more we find, the more we shine. The more we shine, the more they whine. Oh, how sublime. Why is it that we have done this? We have no fear of scratching in the ground or looking in manuscript when it comes to Christianity. We have no fear because we know that God preserved all the way through. He preserved manuscripts. He preserved lectionaries. He preserved early church fathers' quotations. Even when they were burned and being destroyed by the edict of Diocletian in 300 AD, he yet gave us enormous amount of wealth of material, knowing that this would be the debate for today. The question everybody is asking, which is a legitimate question, if you really believe that there was a man named Muhammad who lived from 570 to 632 there in a place called Mecca and Medina in the Hijaz, then for heaven's sakes, give us some proof that he was there. Give us some proof that he received this book. Give us some proof of the city he lived in. For heaven's sakes, give us some proof that this man existed. That's all we're asking. Other than that, if we can do it with Jesus, why can't you do it with Muhammad? If you can just find somebody that referred to him outside of Islam, that's what we're going to touch next, because I'm going to hit that one and shut that one in our next talk that we do together, because there are lots of references to someone named Muhammad, none to Muhammad. So what am I talking about? Well, we'll get into that next, not tonight.
You've got lots of more resources. We love to hear them. We love to learn them and then see if it works or it doesn't.
Actually, this is going to answer your very first question. Why is it they had to write this so late? Why is it all had to be introduced, not just in the 9th and 10th century, in the 12th, 13th, and 14th, and 16th century? The next section that I was going to do tonight, that will answer everything you're looking for. But that's going to come next.
Better question is, why on earth Muslims who got given them brain still following man called Muhammad? That's better question to ask, actually. Thank you very much for joining me, Jay. Really, really appreciate. I'm sorry I kept you longer than I wanted or you wanted. As well as thank you very much everyone who joined us in the chat, and thank you for your contribution to the conversation as well. By God's grace, we will see you on another live stream. I think, can't remember, sometime next week I will have Robert Spencer and Jay Smith to talk about whether Muhammad was existed or not. Actually, no, critical biography of Muhammad. We will be talking about that book, and that will give us more questions. If you are going to be around for that live stream, make sure you've got your notebook to take notes and take questions, and by that time please get the book as well.
There it is.
Get the book.
Not just me asking this question. Hatun is asking this question, and so is Robert Spencer. But notice, everything he's going to be looking at is from evidence that's on the ground, not from the 9th, 10th, 11th, and now as we're saying 12th, 13th, 14th, 16th, and 18th century, he is going to ask, where is this man in the 7th century? Yeah. We've had to answer that question for Jesus Christ from the 1st century. Why can't Muslims find any evidence for him in the 7th century? More to later.
I'm amazed that eternal Son of God steps into the world in 1st century to rescue and redeem us, and our hearts want Muslims to get out of that false ideology and turn to our delightful and glorious God.
Amen.
Thank you very much for being bridges for that, Jay. By God's grace, I will see you sometime next week. And once again, thank you very much everyone who joined us. We'll see you on another live stream.
Bye-bye.